loving person, had a big heart.
Anthony was very charismatic. He was the type of person that people gravitated to. When I saw him coming through the door, I said, "Are you homicide?" He said yes, and then he told me that Anthony was gone. I felt like my skin wasn't touching me anywhere. I have never in my life felt that type of agony ever.
This person was a target. This wasn't a random act of violence.
There were two separate shooters shooting from the front and one from the back.
Police get another call about a fatal shooting, this time on the southeast side of town.
I could see my son. I knew it was him.
We need to look at that angle, that these could be related.
The never-ending cycle of revenge.
It might be sweet in the moment, but it leads to having to look over your shoulder for the rest of your life.
As the second biggest city in Texas, San Antonio encompasses diversity, both in its people and its neighborhoods.
San Antonio is built on a loop. It's a city that is in a big circle, and in that circle, there are siloed communities.
The northwest side of San Antonio, specifically close to the medical center area, is generally a quiet area. The med center is a good area to live in. There's also a university close by, so there's, college students that live there.
It's just before 2 a.m. on January 7th, 2020, when the San Antonio Police Department is alerted to a situation in the parking lot of an apartment complex on the northwest side.
We did receive 911 calls from residents about a shooting. Reports where there were several shots fired.
Officers respond.
They did find a victim in the parking lot who had suffered apparent gunshot wounds.
Bystanders are attempting first aid on the young male. But damage is too severe.
Officers find that he is dead on arrival. There's nothing that can be done to save him.
Soon, homicide detectives arrive.
One thing that really stuck out to me was the fact that he had socks on his feet, but he didn't have shoes on. This told me that he probably lived in the apartment complex.
Once the medical examiner arrives, they're able to search through the victim's pockets to see if he happens to have any sort of identification on him, but unfortunately, he didn't.
A bystander speaks up, claiming to have seen the victim frequently coming and going from one of the apartments.
One of the witnesses pointed out they believed it was his vehicle. And so we ran the registration on that and came up with the name Anthony Saint.
Born in 1989, Anthony's early years were spent on the move.
Anthony was born at Maxwell Air Force Base. He was my oldest son when I was an airman in the Air Force. I got orders to another base. I was stationed in England, Upper Heyford, England, and we moved there where we lived for about 1.5 years. After that, I separated from the military and then moved to San Antonio, Texas.
Eventually, Anthony's mother gave birth to 2 more sons.
Anthony, he had 2 little brothers, loved them to death. He was definitely like that father figure.
Anthony was a very, very active child. I learned very early on that he was full of energy. He loved football, and as he got older in high school, he became a high school football star. He was a running back, and he broke records.
He was a little more athletic than most of the guys at his school. Like they looked up to him and expected big plays from him, and he delivered that.
Anthony's hopes and dreams in high school was to be a football player. He wanted to play professionally. When he came to the awareness that he had to go to college and do well in college in order to do that, I feel like his dreams shifted to music and entertainment. Anthony wanted to be a rapper. He wanted to do other, things in the entertainment industry. And Patrick was the one who kind of stepped out there and learned how the business worked and then tried to draw his friends, Anthony included, into the pattern that was going to work for what they were trying to accomplish. So Patrick was his manager.
I believe that music was a way of him to stay connected to Chris. I believe that music was a way for him to express himself, his emotions, his feelings, what he was going through. A lot of the music that he wrote was based off of real life situations that he was experiencing.
Anthony came up with the idea that he wanted to do a song with the two of us. He wanted to rap and then wanted me to sing. So he wrote the lyrics and then I just came up with a hook to it and sang behind it. We went to a studio in town where we put down the very first recording. He was over the hills, excited to be in the studio with me.
The song is actually called Mama. That song was real near and dear to his heart. He really was passionate about having a song with his mom on there singing.
Anthony's talent was clear, but his biggest fans would always be his family.
His two little brothers copied him because he had the braids first and then he ended up getting dreads and then they got the dreads. But yeah, he wanted to see them succeed. He wanted to, when he learned things, he wanted to pass it down to them. His mama, that was his baby. He loved her more than anything on this earth.
My relationship with Anthony was a day-to-day. If I didn't talk to him every day, I spoke to him every other day. We were in constant communication about whatever was going on in his life at that particular time. And I am the type of mom that, I want to make sure that my kids are okay.
But on the evening of January 7th, 2020, police have tentatively identified Anthony as the victim of a shooting.
I could see that the victim had been shot multiple times. I couldn't tell where exactly. And we can't move the victims around. We have to wait for the medical examiner's investigator to get there.
Investigators hope one of the onlookers saw what happened.
Officers found that they were not eyewitnesses, but were ear witnesses to the incident. These individuals reported hearing multiple gunshots and then hearing screeching tires that were leading away from the apartment complex.
For police, that scene was really difficult to work. It's pretty dark, so the police were relying very heavily on their own lighting techniques by the police car lights.
They're looking for anything that could potentially lead them to find out what happened to this victim.
There was a cell phone near the victim. That being there told me that was probably the victim's cell phone. We weren't able to get into the cell phone. It was locked. So we didn't have a code, an access code or passcode to get into it.
And this could be something that ends up being a huge piece of evidence.
I look at the rest of the scene and I notice the shell casings that are laying about. There were about 9 markers locating shell casings. So there were 9 shell casings near the victim's body.
And they were all close to the body, suggesting that they were close range.
They found several shell casings on his body and around the body, really emphasizing the amount of firepower.
The police had a lot of work to do to figure out what exactly had happened here.
This wasn't a random act of violence.
On January 7th, 2020, San Antonio investigators are looking into the shooting death of Anthony Sanks on the city's northwest side. After hours of working the scene in the dark, investigators head back to the station.
When we got back to our office, we did some research on the registration. We were able to get a photograph of the registered owner of one of the vehicles, and it did look like the victim at the scene. So around 4 or 5 hours after we've released the scene, we go back, because now we have daylight hours. We go back to look for any cameras in the area. We do notice that there are some around the office, which is located at an entry-exit point for the apartment complex. We had to wait for employees to show up. When they did show up, they confirmed they did have recorded footage of the area in front of the office building, which would show us vehicles coming and going. We were able to look at the footage. We did notice one vehicle come in, a small dark-colored SUV, and we were able to see it actually leave after the shooting. Couldn't get a license plate, couldn't see the people inside. It was a black Jeep Compass. A hubcap was missing off one of the tires, and then it had a broken taillight on the back.
They knew now that that vehicle was at the apartment complex at the time of the shooting. They were able to match up the time codes and know that that was most likely the suspect vehicle at that point.
When the officers were getting the surveillance video, they were also able to inquire as to the residents of the apartment that the witness has identified as seeing the victim going in and out of.
We knocked. The occupant did answer. It was a young female. She invited us in. She explained to us that she did know Mr. Sanks and that she was allowing him to stay there. She explained that she was a lifelong friend of his. The night before, she had gone out with some friends, did some drinking, came home around 12:40 a.m. She had bought some food.
The last time that she had seen the victim, he was still playing video games in the living room.
She explained that she's a very heavy sleeper, said she didn't hear anything as far as gunshots. She didn't know he was even gone until we knocked on the door and woke her up.
The roommate tells investigators that she knows Anthony's mother.
She currently was working with Mr. Sanks' mother at her hair salon, and she gave us that information of where that was located. And she told us that his mother would actually be there at that point, opening up for the day. We left the apartment complex and we wanted to get to her as soon as we could. We wanted her to know as soon as possible what happened.
When I saw him coming through the door, I said, "Are you homicide?" He said, "Yes." I said, "I just need you to say it." He said, "I need you to sit down." I said, "No, I need you to say it." And then he told me that Anthony was gone. At that point, I felt like my skin wasn't touching me anywhere. I have never in my life felt that type of agony ever.
The toughest part of this job is notifying a family when they've lost a loved one. You could automatically tell the love lost for this woman.
I did not know of anyone who would want to gun my son down in a parking lot in the middle of the night. I didn't know of anyone that would want to do this.
She didn't know of any problems he would have had with anyone, but we really needed more help. We told her we did have his phone, and we believed we had his phone, and we asked her if she knew the passcode for it.
We gave him the code to the phone, and that was it. And I asked him, "Please, I need you to find out who did this to my son." And he says, "I'm going to do my very best."
Getting into the cell phone that we believed was Mr. Sanks' phone was vital. We knew that he left that apartment and went out in the parking lot. We knew he didn't have shoes on, so he was probably going out there to meet someone he knew. That phone was probably going to tell us who he was communicating with and why he walked out into the parking lot.
Investigators check the last activity on the phone.
They're able to locate on Facebook Messenger that the victim was going to meet someone right before he was murdered. And they were able to get that Facebook Messenger handle. There was a handle NHC Bobo that the victim was communicating with.
We knew that person came over. We knew they were communicating with Mr. Sanks. And we knew Mr. Sanks went out there to meet NHC Bobo in the parking lot. NHC Bobo was going to be someone we needed to find.
Detectives investigating the death of Anthony Sanks get their first break when they access phone messages sent to Anthony moments before he was gunned down.
Police now realize that they need to locate whoever this NHC Bobo is because, you know, they were in direct communication with Anthony almost right before he was murdered.
Hopeful to uncover NHC Bobo's true identity, investigators put the word out.
Homicide detectives rely on officers that are working undercover, working in specific units to be able to assist them in determining the identity of individuals that have nicknames.
While they wait to see if any leads turn up, detectives attend Anthony's autopsy.
I went to the Bexar County Medical Examiner's office. This case was very complex because he had multiple gunshot wounds and they were coming from different directions.
The medical examiner was able to identify 10 gunshot wounds. In this case, the victim was shot several times, 2 times, I believe, in the back, and then 8 entrance wounds in the front. It was safe to assume that there were 2 separate shooters.
The 2 shooters, the multiple gunshot wounds, and the fact that Anthony was lured to the parking lot all support a new theory.
This wasn't a random act of violence. We had to believe this was definitely a targeted hit or a targeted murder.
As far as who targeted Anthony, that remains a mystery.
We still didn't know who NHC Bobo was. So on January 14th, about a week after Mr. Sanks is murdered, I'm contacted by one of our detectives that works in an undercover capacity, works on the street. He had an informant come forward to him who had information about the murder of Mr. Sanks. He told me that this informant explained to him that NHC Bobo is an individual by the name of John Anthony Sheringhausen. We also found that there were text messages on Mr. Sanks' phone from John Sheringhausen. So we knew we had the right guy communicating with Mr. Sanks. The detective also gave me more information about some things that happened which might have been the reason why the murder happened.
The detective explains there was a beef between John Sheringhausen, Anthony Sanks, and a third man, Andrew Salazar.
Supposedly, Anthony Sanks' murder stemmed from a previous incident that had happened in June 2019. Andrew Salazar's home had gotten shot up in a drive-by shooting down on the south side of town. According to rumors on the street, Sheringhausen supposedly was the one who had committed that drive-by shooting.
So we looked into the shooting that occurred at Andrew Salazar's house in June of 2019. He was not present when the shooting happened. His family was there.
We just got home. It was just me, my wife, and my granddaughter. I heard popping noise, but I really didn't know they were shooting. My wife, she heard it louder than I did. She told me, hey, they shot at the house. I went outside and I looked. This probably was like a 12 or 13 rounds probably. And I got scared. We had to move out real quick, so we moved out within a month.
They didn't see who did it. They couldn't say who did it. We didn't know, if they were truly the targeted people or if it was a random thing that maybe caught in the crossfire or someone picked the wrong house to shoot up.
Investigators hope that one man might be able to shed light on the incident.
Talking to John Scherenhausen was my big goal. Find out what he knew, what information he had. He had a lot of things to explain.
Investigators obtain a warrant for Scherenhausen's arrest, but he is nowhere to be found.
We'll solicit the assistance from the U.S. Marshal Service. We had people from those agencies helping us look for John Scherenhausen.
Then, just 2 weeks after Anthony Sank's death, more bloodshed.
So officers are dispatched to a 911 call where neighbors in the area heard multiple gunshots and saw two males running from a vehicle that was still at the location, and they could see an individual slumped over at the steering wheel.
Officers respond, and they were able to then establish that the victim was Andrew Salazar.
Just 2 weeks after Anthony Sanks was shot 10 times in a parking lot, San Antonio police get word another man, allegedly connected to the case, has just been gunned down. Detectives are processing the scene where Andrew Salazar was shot dead inside his truck.
There was a bystander among the people who were there who by chance was going to meet up with the victim. The bystander identified the truck as the car that Andrew Salazar frequently drove, and that's how police were able to then run the plates and identify the next of kin.
His girlfriend called my wife and told her, have you talked to Andrew? And my wife told him no. It was a shooting. She gave us the address, and I kept trying to call him on the phone, and he wasn't answering. It was a pretty long ride going out there. I saw the truck. I used to work for the police department, so one of the officers recognized me there. And so they let me kind of go closer than I was supposed to. I could see my son. I knew he was there.
Andrew Salazar was born on March 22, 1991 in Fort Worth, Texas. The Salazar family relocated to San Antonio when Anthony was 3. That's where Anthony grew up, the third of 5 children.
They were all a year apart, but they were just siblings. They would get along with each other, and sometimes they would fight with each other. We're a real close-knit family.
Andrew was still a teenager himself when he started his own family.
Him and his girlfriend were real young. They were like close to 17, I think, 17, 16. At that time, they were living with us when she was pregnant. So they did live with us for pretty much like probably 2 years.
Despite his youth, Andrew was a devoted father who wanted to provide for his son.
Every school function he would go to, whenever they had the field trips, he would go to the field trips. He would be organizing all his birthday parties. His goal was to establish a business, either doing any kind of, remodeling or construction or anything like that. I mean, he had a lot of endeavors. He believed in doing a lot of things, but I guess he never had a chance to do it.
On January 22nd, 2020, Andrew's dreams are cut short when he's gunned down inside his truck.
Me and my wife were there, and we were crying. We called my kids. My other 2 sons got there too.
As Andrew's family attempts to process the sudden loss, detectives get to work.
There's a witness identified who she was coming home from work, and when she arrives at her house, she notices his pickup truck stopped in front of her home.
She sees brake lights first, then flashers. Then the next thing she hears is gunshots, and she observes 2 males running from the car with hoodies, both running in a northern direction.
Word of Andrew's death reaches Detective Size, who has been working the shooting death of Anthony Sanks for the past 2 weeks.
When I found out who the victim was, Andrew Salazar, I contacted that detective and told him, hey, I believe your case is going to be related to my case involving the murder of Anthony Sanks.
With Andrew Salazar dead, investigators are more eager than ever to speak with John Scheringhausen. On February 10th, 16 days after the second murder, investigators catch a break.
John Scheringhausen was found. He was with a friend. They stopped him in a vehicle. He did speak with me. We were focused on the Anthony Sanks murder. He did say he knew who Sanks was, but denied knowing anything about the shooting as far as who did it and how. And then he's confronted with some of the evidence that we have, but we knew he was communicating with him. He knew he was kind of cornered and he had to explain his way out. So he tried.
Scheringhausen says that Andrew Salazar believed Anthony Sanks was responsible for the drive-by. And he was right.
He said that he actually did that shooting under the direction of Anthony Sanks, and that Andrew Salazar found out that it was him and confronted him about it.
Andrew hit him with a threat.
Scheringhausen explained that Andrew Salazar told him, "You will help me get back at Anthony Sanks, and if you don't, then I'll kill you."
But Scheringhausen says he didn't accompany Andrew Salazar to kill Anthony Sanks. Instead, he claims another man took on that role.
He said that we needed to get Anthony Jiggy Nash.
Scheringhausen claims his role was limited to loaning the men his phone so they could use it to lure Anthony Sanks outside.
Anthony Sanks was his good friend. He tells detectives he was forced by Andrew Salazar to give over his phone, and that Andrew Salazar had been the one that had messaged the victim, setting the victim up to be murdered, that it wasn't him. He tells detectives that Anthony Nash and Andrew Salazar took his phone and left in Anthony Nash's vehicle to go over and set Anthony Sanks up to be murdered.
I asked him, "Can you give me some more specific detail about the vehicle?" And he stops and thinks, and he says, "Well, yeah, it had a broken taillight, the broken driver's side taillight." When he said it was a black Jeep Compass, we were able to take the information he gave, compare it to the video. It was a Jeep, just like he was explaining to us.
Detectives start to look a little bit more into Anthony Nash. They do discover that his vehicle registration matches the vehicle that they saw on surveillance leaving the apartment complex the night of Anthony Sanks' murder. They realize some of the things that Scheringhausen is telling them is actually true.
John Scheringhausen claims he was not there when Anthony Nash and Andrew Salazar gunned Anthony Sanks down. But investigators aren't so sure he is being honest about his role.
He gave very detailed information about what happened when they got there. And that Sanks came out, and that Nash got out and started shooting him, and that Drew came around and also shot Anthony Sanks, but claiming he wasn't there. To have that kind of detail, we didn't think people involved would tell him in that good of detail what happened. So we knew that he was there.
Investigators confront him. Instead of coming clean, Scheringhausen changes the subject.
Knowing that he was getting really deeper and deeper cornered as far as Anthony Sanks' murder, I think he tried to help himself by providing information about Andrew Salazar's murder.
The information he gives the detectives about that is that Anthony Nash, who he called Jiggy, got really nervous after Anthony Sanks' murder and believed that Andrew Salazar was setting him up to turn him into the police. And so Anthony Nash got concerned about this and that he was the one who killed Andrew Salazar.
He again denied that he was there. He claimed that Andrew was murdered by Anthony Nash. Nash, pulled a gun out, and shot Salazar in the truck. And then fled after that.
Detectives make sure Sheringhausen knows they aren't buying his claims of innocence.
To have that kind of detail, we knew that he was there, he was in that Jeep. After interviewing John Sheringhausen, he was told that he was under arrest for the murder of Anthony Sanks.
Investigators attempt to track down Anthony Nash.
They were unable to locate him. They spoke with his father, who said that soon after these murders that he had been in a mental institution, and after the hospitalization had gone to Louisiana.
We didn't know where he was. We had him in the system. We had a bolo that we needed to speak to him.
Finally, after over a year of looking, investigators get word that Anthony Nash is back in San Antonio.
We had just enough probable cause in the Anthony Sanks case to arrest Nash. Just enough. It came down to Sheringhausen, what he provided to us, able to see that vehicle that was involved. We were able to say, you know, that we knew Nash had that type of vehicle. Arrest warrant was obtained on July 21st of 2021, and he was arrested at his mother's apartment.
When detectives went to speak with him, he was unwilling to give any information.
Even with 2 arrests, detectives still have work to do.
After Anthony Nash is arrested and charged with the murder of Anthony Sanks, I started to dive more into the Andrew Salazar case. If I could get closer to arresting Nash for that murder as well.
Investigators revisit a piece of evidence that had been handed over by Andrew's father. After his son's vehicle was released back to the family, Jesus Salazar found something.
And I found some keys to a vehicle in the truck. So that's what I recovered those, and I called the detective, and I told him, I got these keys.
He found the key in there, didn't know whose it was or what it was for, and thought it might be important, so that's why he gave it to police. He said he also noticed in a social media photograph of Sheringhausen and Nash together that it looked like the same key that was hanging on the belt loop of Anthony Nash.
Nash had those keys that were inside my truck. I said, look, those are the same keys, keychain. So I sent the picture to the detective.
It was exactly like the key that you can see in the photograph that's hanging on the belt loop of Anthony Nash.
The key was great evidence to show that he was involved.
It's good evidence, but I wanted more. So my next step was then to get phone records.
They were able to get the phone records for Anthony Nash, and they were able to determine that his phone was in the area at the time that Andrew Salazar was murdered.
At this point, after I get those phone records, now I have enough. I have enough to say that Anthony Nash was definitely involved in the murder of Andrew Salazar. So a charge was made against him in that case as well.
Investigators believe more players in the 2 killings remain unidentified. But with no witnesses and no one talking, they focus on Nash and Sheringhausen. A theory about Sheringhausen takes shape.
It was starting to feel more and more like John Sheringhausen was putting this all together, and that it was some type of a power play by him to get rid of these 2 guys so he could maybe get a bigger name for himself on the streets.
But when it comes to the second crime, investigators cannot prove his involvement.
The charge was not brought against him in the Andrew Salazar case.
Law enforcement also cannot prove that Sheringhausen fired any shots the day Anthony Sanks was killed. But prosecutors are confident they can still hold him accountable.
We relied almost exclusively on the cell phone and Facebook Messenger evidence that we had. Anything that an individual would do to promote, assist in the plan or in the carrying out of a murder makes that person just as guilty as an individual who shoots and kills.
As John Sheringhausen's trial approaches, prosecutors piece together what they believe took place the day Anthony Sanks was gunned down.
I believe that Andrew Salazar was out for revenge and talked John Sheringhausen into helping him set up Anthony Sanks to be killed. I believe that Anthony Nash drove them over there to kill Anthony Sanks. I believe that once at the location, I think that John Sheringhausen got out of the vehicle, that Anthony Sanks went to go and meet him, and then Andrew Salazar got out and began shooting, and then John Sheringhausen began shooting too.
But when Sheringhausen's trial begins in October 2021, prosecutors must stick to what they can prove.
I could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was one of the shooters without any eyewitnesses, without anybody being able to say that he had told them that he had murdered the victim. However, we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the individual was at a very minimum a party to the murder. There was no getting out of him being present with his phone when Anthony Sanks was murdered. At the same time his phone was messaging the victim, he was also messaging a girlfriend, referencing that he was going to hit a lick. Hitting a lick either means murdering someone or robbing someone. As soon as he was done, he was going to go over and meet her. Those messages were sent right before the murder. And so based on that information, we knew without a doubt that he was present at the murder. He aided, he planned, he assisted in this murder, and that's why he was guilty. As soon as that evidence was presented, his attorney was approaching me, telling me that his client had changed his mind. His client had decided to change his plea to guilty.
It became so damning that Mr. Sheringhausen had no choice. And that's when he, of course, changed his mind.
The judge sentenced the defendant, John Sheringhausen, to 40 years in prison for the murder of Anthony Sanks.
In February 2023, Anthony Nash accepts a deal.
I did not believe that Anthony Nash was a shooter in the Anthony Sanks murder. I believe that he was the getaway driver. Anthony Nash's vehicle was driven into and out of the parking lot, and the information from the witnesses at the scene, the shots were very quickly followed by screeching tires. So I did not believe that the person who drove the vehicle away from the scene was one of the individuals who had been out shooting. I believe that his involvement, his culpability was lesser. We offered him 20 years in prison to run concurrently on both murders. And ultimately, he accepted that instead of going to a trial.
We never were able to clearly define that, but I'm pretty satisfied with the fact that John Sheringhausen manipulated all these people, constructed this entire thing, and made it happen. And because of his actions, you know, 2 people lost their lives, 2 young people lost their lives, and 2 families were affected forever by it.
I don't think that closure exists. I think that you get to the place where you get used to it. You get to the place where you wrap your head around it. You do things differently to cope with it. But I don't think that closure really exists. There was a sense of possibly that justice would be served, but not relief at all.
Because when you get revenge on somebody, most of the time it's going to be somebody else that want to come and get revenge back on you. And then it just turns into the never-ending cycle of revenge.
Revenge doesn't really pay back anything. I don't believe in revenge.
The Montreal winter of 1989 did not whisper. It bit. On the afternoon of December 6th, a thin, biting wind swept off the St. Lawrence River, ghosting to the limestone streets and clinging to the gray, monolithic facade of the École Polytechnique. Inside, the air was a thick, comforting soup of stale coffee, industrial floor wax, and the dry, paper-scented hum of late-semester anxiety. Students were huddled over drafting tables and humming computers, their minds a frantic tally of impending final exams and thin, fragile promise of a bright future in engineering. It was a normal Wednesday, the kind of mundane, predictable cycle that forms the bedrock of a student's life. Until it wasn't. In the hallways, the rhythm was dictated by the clicking of heels on linoleum and the muted murmurs of intellectual debate. No one looked up when the outer doors groaned open, letting in a sudden, sharp gust of sub-zero air. No one paid attention to the man stepping into the lobby, his face a static mask of cold neutrality, his eyes fixed on a horizon that only he could see. He moved with a strange, unnatural efficiency, an interloper in a sanctuary of logic and ambition. The world inside those walls was built on equations, on the predictable laws of physics, and the steady climb toward professional mastery. But the man walking to the corridor was a variable of pure, unadulterated chaos. He was not there to learn, nor was he there to participate in the collaborative spirit of the institution. He was there to dismantle, to silence, and to rewrite the history of the building in the most visceral, unforgiving ink imaginable. The atmosphere began to warp, a subtle shifting of pressure that the most intuitive students might have felt in the small of their backs. It was the silence that started it. A sudden, creeping absence of the usual chatter as the man made his way toward the classrooms. The lighting in the hallways flickered, casting long, jittery shadows against the walls covered in academic posters and schedules of upcoming lectures. He was a silent shadow, clutching a heavy, rectangular weight concealed beneath his coat, a piece of industrial hardware that stood in stark, jarring contrast to the textbooks and calculators clutched by the young women passing him by. Every step he took was a countdown, a measured cadence of destruction that would soon shatter the stillness of the afternoon. There was no indication that, in the space of 20 minutes, this quiet, unassuming space of higher learning would be transformed into a theater of unimaginable cruelty. The students in mechanical engineering classrooms were deeply immersed in their work, lost in the elegance of geometry and the structure of machines, completely unaware that the structure of their own lives was about to be obliterated. The smell of the cold outside had faded, replaced by the scent of heating systems and the faint, ozone-tinged tang of static electricity. The man reached the threshold of the classroom, his hand tightening around the cold, mechanical grip hidden from view. He was not looking for an answer. He was looking for a target. The world outside remained oblivious. The city buses were still running. The street lights were beginning to glow against the darkening sky, and the ordinary lives of thousands of people continued in a steady, rhythmic pulse. But for those inside the École Polytechnique, the clock had stopped. A dark, jagged crack had formed in the foundation of their reality, and the man standing in the doorway was ready to swing the hammer. The quiet intensity of the lecture, the gentle scratching of pens on paper, and the soft glow of the overhead lights were about to vanish, replaced by a sound so violent and so alien to this place that it would echo across the nation for decades to come, leaving a scar on the collective soul of Canada that would never fully heal. The École Polytechnique did not exist in a vacuum. It was a proud, brutalist bastion of Canadian academic ambition. Perched on the slope of Mount Royal, overlooking the vast, sprawling expanse of Montreal. In 1989, the university was a temple dedicated to the future, a place where the brightest minds in Quebec gathered to master the mechanics of the physical world. The architecture itself was a testament to the era, characterized by hard edges, cold concrete, and an imposing sense of permanence that shielded its inhabitants from the chaotic turbulence of the world beyond its walls. It was a place designed to foster innovation, a crucible where students transformed abstract theories into tangible solutions, believing firmly that if they could define a problem, they could build an answer. The campus breathed with the quiet, earnest intensity of young people on the precipice of their careers, with corridors lined with heavy lockers and windows that framed the deepening indigo of the Quebecois winter dusk. Inside these rooms, the atmosphere was defined by the scratch of fountain pens, the steady tapping of calculators, and persistent low-frequency hum of fluorescent lighting that bathed everything in a clinical, shadowless white. For Mark Lapine, this environment was not a sanctuary, but a reflection of everything he perceived to be fundamentally broken in his own life. He moved through the city of Montreal like a ghost, an outsider haunting the fringes of society he grew to despise. He was a man who lived in the narrow, suffocating space of his own resentment, a self-imposed prison of failure and perceived humiliation. He had walked these same hallways before, perhaps glancing at the notice boards detailing the curriculum he so desperately wanted to claim as his own, yet he had been repeatedly denied entry. To him, the university represented the pinnacle of the establishment, a gated community of intellect and opportunity that had barred its doors against him. His world was not one of engineering blueprints or structural integrity. It was a world of narrowing horizons where every disappointment, every rejection letter, every social awkwardness, every moment of perceived inadequacy was filtered through the lens of a toxic, brewing hatred. He lived in a rented room where the air was thick with the residue of his isolation, a place where he spent hours cultivating the bitterness that eventually became his entire identity. He saw the world divided into simple, jagged lines, winners and losers, the empowered and the marginalized, the men and the women he blamed for his inability to find purchase in a world. He harbored profound, distorted logic that suggested he was a victim of a grand, shifting tide, a tide he labeled as feminism. He viewed the rise of women in professional and academic spaces not as a triumph of quality, but as an active, calculated erasure of his own potential. In his mind, the women occupying the desks at École Polytechnique were not just students. They were the architects of his own erasure. The city of Montreal, meanwhile, was oblivious to the rot festering in his psyche. It was a city of vibrant contrasts, where old-world European charm collided with North American industrial ambition. On that December evening, the streets were bustling with the pre-holiday rush. Shoppers braved the icy winds, their breath blooming into fleeting clouds of mist, while cars crawled through slushy intersections with the rhythmic whine of tires on pavement. The festive spirit was beginning to take hold, with lights draped over storefronts and the distant, muffled sounds of the city preparing for the cold comfort of the season. No one watching the ordinary flow of traffic could have imagined that a single, calculated act was about to freeze that city in time. The campus, with its layers of security and its reputation for safety, seemed immune to the erratic volatility of the human spirit. It was, after all, a place where order reigned supreme. But inside the mind of the man who stood just blocks away, the order had already disintegrated. He was meticulous in his preparation, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence he intended to unleash. He viewed himself as a soldier in a war that only he understood, a war where the battlefront was the lecture hall, and the casualties were those he deemed responsible for his stagnant life. He had acquired his weapon with the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of a man conducting a business transaction, oblivious to the horrific irony of using a tool of precision for an act of pure, blunt force devastation. He spent his days refining his resolve, sharpening his hatred until it was a physical weight in his chest. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as a corrective force, a man reclaiming a narrative that had slipped from his grasp. As he looked out at the lights of Montreal, he did not see a community of people pursuing their dreams. He saw a landscape of targets, a vast, complex machine that had refused to grant him a seat at the table. He was ready to stop the machine, to reach into the intricate, carefully constructed lives of those within the walls of the École and tear it all down, leaving nothing behind but the silence he perfected in his own dark, lonely room. The university stood tall on a hill, a beacon of human achievement, unaware that the shadow approaching it was not an accident, but a long-prepared, deliberate intrusion of the very disorder it existed to overcome. The women who occupied the halls of the École Polytechnique that evening were the embodiment of a new era, young pioneers in a field that had long been a fortress of male exclusivity. They were architects of the future, women who had fought through the rigors of competitive exams, late-night study sessions, and the unspoken pressure of being the few in a sea of many. Among them, Genevieve Bergeron stood out as a vibrant thread in the fabric of the university community. She was more than just a student of civil engineering. She was a talented musician, a woman who understood the harmony of structures both in wood and wire and in the complex physics of load-bearing walls. Her dreams were etched in blue ink on drafting paper, a vision of bridges that could connect worlds and infrastructure that could sustain life. She walked through the corridors with a steady, determined pace, her mind undoubtedly racing through calculations or the upcoming melody of concerto, her presence a testament to a quiet, unshakable resolve. She was the daughter of a family that had nurtured her intellect, a young woman whose potential was not merely a career path, but a promise to a world that was still catching up to her capabilities. In the classrooms, she was joined by peers like Helene Colgan, a bright, inquisitive mind who had chosen engineering not because it was easy, but because it was challenging. Helene possessed a sharp sense of humor and an unwavering loyalty to her friends, a young woman who saw the world as a series of problems to be solved with creativity and grit. She was the kind of student who lingered after class to debate the finer points of material science, her enthusiasm contagious, her laughter often punctuating the sterile, gray atmosphere of the lecture halls. Like so many of her classmates, she was looking forward to break, to the simple joy of coming home for the holidays, unaware that her story would end in the middle of a sentence. They were a collective of individuals, engineers, designers, dreamers, who represented the changing tide of the 20th century. There was Natalie Croto, whose focus and diligence were the envy of her study group, a woman who carried herself with a poise that suggested a long, successful life ahead. There was Barbara Daigneault, whose passion for mechanical engineering was matched only by her dedication to her community. These women were not just students. They were daughters, sisters, and friends, people who carried the hopes of their parents and the expectations of society that was slowly opening its doors. They moved through their day with a sense of purpose, traversing the stairwells and cramped, paper-filled offices with the familiarity of people who belonged there. Their lives were filled with the mundane beauty of the everyday, the shared thermos of coffee, the stress over a particularly difficult final, the plans for a weekend trip, the simple comfort of knowing that they were part of a larger, intellectual pursuit. They navigated a world that was often daunting, yet they did so with a grace that was entirely their own. There was a profound, quiet strength in their presence, a collective momentum that defined the very essence of a university. They were the ones who stayed late to finish a project, the ones who helped one another through the crushing weight of academic expectations, and the ones who brought a necessary, vibrant perspective to a discipline that had been stagnant for far too long. To view them through the lens of tragedy is to strip them of the lives they were actively, joyously living. Before that winter night, they were not symbols. They were flesh and blood, individuals with distinct voices, private fears, and grand, sprawling ambitions. They were people who loved the texture of a crisp winter morning and the warmth of a shared laugh in the cafeteria. They were individuals who had survived the grueling selection process of the university, proving their worth and their intellect time and time again. They were the ones who had gone on to build the roads we travel today, to design the systems that keep our cities running, and to lead the charge into new, uncharted territories of human achievement. Their potential was a radiant, undeniable thing, a promise that had been meticulously cultivated and was finally ready to bloom. They lived in a reality where the future was a tangible, reachable thing, a horizon they were collectively steering toward, step by step, calculation by calculation. The tragedy of their end is not just in the loss of what they were, but in the theft of the women they were destined to become, the brilliance that would have lit up the field of engineering for decades, and the simple, human connections that would have rippled outward from their lives, influencing everyone they touched. They were the heartbeat they call a rhythmic, steady pulse of potential that was silenced in a moment of incomprehensible madness, leaving behind a void that no amount of time or policy change could ever truly fill. They remain in memory, as the architect of a reality that was cut short, their presence lingering in the silent, empty spaces of the halls they once filled with the energy of 1,000 bright, unwritten futures. The shift happened at 5:10 p.m., a time that should have been marked by the gentle winding down of an academic day, but was instead punctuated by the sharp, piercing report of gunfire. Mark Lapine stepped through the double doors of the main building, his presence initially mistaken for the erratic behavior of a student or perhaps an eccentric visitor. The air in the corridor, previously thick with the smell of floor wax and the low hum of conversation, instantly curdled. He moved with the precision of a hunter who has spent weeks imagining this exact landscape, his eyes tracking the movement of students with a cold, detached scrutiny. The transition from a space of learning to a killing field was not a gradual erosion. It was a violent, instantaneous rupture of the social contract. He approached the registrar's office first, the glass partition acting as a fragile, futile barrier between order and total carnage. The first shots were erratic, echoing against the hard, industrial surfaces of the building, creating a cacophony of sound that was initially misinterpreted by those nearby as construction work or perhaps a playful prank. Then, the realization settled in with the weight of cold lead. He did not hesitate, and he did not seek to negotiate. He bypassed the terrified staff and moved deeper into the labyrinthine corridors, his boots clicking rhythmically against the linoleum. Every room he entered became a microcosm of the horror he had cultivated in his mind. The sound of the Ruger Mini 14 was deafening in the confined space, a mechanical stutter that swallowed the frantic screams of those caught in his path. He was not looking for a general slaughter. He was searching for a specific demographic, his rage fueled by a distorted ideology that had consumed his entire being. In a large, crowded classroom, the sudden intrusion caused a wave of confusion that quickly transmuted into raw, primal terror. Lapine did not simply storm in. He issued a command, his voice devoid of emotion, cutting to the rising panic like a serrated blade. He ordered the men to leave. In the fleeting, agonizing second that followed, the room split in two. The men, dazed and terrified, scrambled for the exits, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. The women, left behind in the sudden, hollow silence of the room, stood paralyzed as the reality of their situation dawned on them. Lapine did not offer mercy, nor did he offer a moment of reflection. He shouted his declaration of war against feminism, a proclamation that felt like a surreal, nightmare iteration of the societal tensions he blamed for his existence. The gunfire that followed was methodical. He did not spray bullets randomly. He aimed with the focus of a man completing a dark, preordained task. The air in the room, once filled with the mundane sounds of academic discourse, became thick with the copper tang of blood and the acrid, biting scent of gunpowder. He moved from row to row, the cold metal of his rifle a stark, brutal contrast to the soft geometry of the drafting paper still resting on the desks. The students ducked under tables, their hands trembling as they tried to find cover in a room that offered none. Some tried to barricade themselves behind the heavy furniture, while others reached out to one another, their final moments defined by a desperate, human need for connection in the face of absolute isolation. Lapine's expression remained a mask of static neutrality, a man operating under the delusion that he was rectifying systemic failure. The sound of his rampage echoed into the hallways, drawing the attention of students and staff who were now running blindly, their faces contorted with shock and confusion. He did not remain in one location for long. He moved with fluid, haunting efficiency, traversing the building's levels as if he were navigating the familiar floor plan of his own mind. He entered the cafeteria, a space designed for community and nourishment, and transformed into a site of frantic survival. The scene was one of impossible chaos. Overturned chairs, shattered glass, and the frantic, echoing screams that seemed to bounce off the concrete walls. He hunted, and he waited, his eyes scanning for the silhouettes of those he had categorized as his enemies. There was no negotiation, no possibility of dialogue. There was only the cold, mechanical rhythm of the weapon and the sudden, jarring silence that followed each discharge. As the minutes bled into one another, the school became a landscape of scattered belongings. A discarded backpack, a notebook containing half-finished equations, a single shoe left behind in the sprint for safety. Lapine was a storm moving through a garden, uprooting the vibrant, growing potential of the students, and leaving nothing but the wreckage of their lives in his wake. Outside, the city of Montreal remained oblivious to the devastation unfolding behind the stone walls of the university. The cold, crisp air of the evening continued to circulate. The city lights continued to blink in their ordered, rhythmic patterns, and the traffic continued its steady, uncaring crawl through the streets. Inside the walls, the time had warped into a singular, agonizing loop of violence. He continued his hunt, his ammunition depleting, his resolve hardening with every act of destruction. He reached a final, secluded area, the weight of the day and the weight of his own monstrous actions beginning to press down on him. The air was heavy, saturated with the frantic energy of 100 interrupted futures. He saw the end of his path, the final line he had been drafting since he first conceived of this horrific design. With a calculated final motion, he turned the weapon upon himself, the sound of the final shot signaling the abrupt, jarring conclusion to the 20 minutes of terror. The silence that rushed back into the rooms was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The man who had sought to reorder the world by dismantling the lives of those he hated lay still, leaving the school to grapple with the aftermath of his madness. The halls, which had once rung with the ambitious, hopeful voices of young engineers, were now a tomb of questions, a site of profound grief, and a permanent, jagged scar on the history of a country that had believed it was far beyond such visceral, intimate, and calculated hatred. The smoke from the final shot dissipated into the sterile air, leaving the building to exist in the chilling, hollow quiet of a space where everything had been changed forever. The silence that descended upon the École Polytechnique after the final gunshot was not the peaceful quiet of an empty building. It was a heavy, suffocating shroud that seemed to press against the very walls of the structure. The air was thick with the acrid, lingering scent of cordite and the sharp, metallic tang of blood, a sensory cocktail that served as a grim testament to the violence that had just unfolded. The first responders, arriving in the wake of the frantic, garbled distress calls, stepped into a scene that defied the clinical, rational world they were trained to navigate. What they found was a landscape of frozen motion. Overturned chairs, scattered notebooks, and the chilling, stark reality of bodies resting in the postures of their final moments. The corridors, once filled with a familiar, rhythmic cadence of student life, were now marked by the jagged, chaotic debris of survival. The police, their faces etched with a combination of professional detachment and profound, burgeoning horror, began to sweep through the building, their flashlights cutting through the gloom of the late afternoon. Every room was a new iteration of the same nightmare. In the mechanical engineering classroom, the aftermath was particularly visceral. Papers, some stained with the unmistakable dark crimson of human life, lay strewn across the floor, covered in the intricate, elegant diagrams of engineering problems that would never be solved. The desks, intended for the pursuit of knowledge, were now warped and pockmarked by the force of the rifle's impact. The investigators moved with a somber, deliberate gait, their voices reduced to whispers as they documented the scene. Each photograph they took a permanent, haunting record of tragedy that felt too large to comprehend. The discovery process was an exercise in systematic, soul-crushing detail. They cataloged the ballistic evidence, the spent casings that had littered the floors like fallen teeth, and the personal items that served as heartbreaking totems of the victims. A single earring, a crushed pair of glasses, a student ID card resting on a desk, a silent, official acknowledgement of life suddenly and violently rendered non-existent. There were no grand clues, no complex webs of intrigue. The evidence pointed to a solitary, focused act of hatred. As the tactical teams cleared the rooms, they found the victims, their bodies marking the path of the shooter's journey. The investigators had to process the scene with an agonizing, meticulous care, understanding that every piece of physical evidence was a silent witness to the final, frantic struggle of these young women. Amidst the chaos, the first clues to the motive began to emerge, not in the form of confession or manifesto left in the open, but in the clinical, terrifying focus of the crime scene itself. The investigators noted the deliberate pattern of the attacks, the way the shooter had systematically targeted his victims, ignoring those who did not fit his distorted profile. It was clear that this was not a random act of insanity. It was a premeditated, ideological strike. In the quiet, hollow spaces of the building, the realization began to dawn on the law enforcement officers that they were not merely investigating a mass murder. They were documenting a targeted, lethal expression of misogyny. This realization changed the tenor of the investigation, shifting it from a search for a perpetrator to a search for the roots of a hatred so profound that it had manifested in such a public, devastating way. As night fully descended upon Montreal, the exterior of the building was transformed into a spectacle of flashing blue and red lights, casting long, frantic shadows against the gray concrete. The media had begun to gather, their cameras and microphones a buzzing, predatory hive, hungry for details of the horror that had gripped the university. Inside, the work continued. The detectives, their minds racing to keep pace with the gravity of the scene, began to piece together the shooter's identity. When the name finally surfaced, Mark Lepine, it was accompanied by the initial, chilling details of his life. He was not a stranger to the system, nor was he a phantom. He was a man who left a trail of rejection and resentment, a man who had been hiding in plain sight, quietly cultivating his lethal intent. The discovery of his final note was the ultimate, horrifying confirmation of the motive. Found tucked away, it was a document that chilled the detectives to their core, a list of names, a roadmap of future targets, and an articulation of a worldview so warped that it felt alien to the reality of the society they served. It was a cold, calculated inventory of the people he deemed responsible for his own failings, a chilling testament to the power of one man's unchecked, simmering animosity. The note provided the final piece of the puzzle, sealing the nature of the crime and cementing its place as an act of ideological terror. The scene, as it was processed through the long, agonizing hours of the night, became a reflection of the city's shock. Families began to gather at the perimeter, their faces masks of desperate, unformed hope that quickly shattered into the raw, jagged agony of grief as the news of their losses filtered out. The silence inside the École Polytechnique was replaced by the collective, muffled weeping of a community forced to confront an impossible reality. Every desk, every corner of the hallway, and every shattered window became a site of profound, communal mourning. The investigation, which had begun as a forensic puzzle, was now a funeral procession, a steady, solemn march through the wreckage of the lives that had been snuffed out. The clues gathered were no longer just evidence in a criminal case. They were the remnants of the dreams, ambitions, and futures of 14 women, a haunting catalog of everything that had been lost in the span of 20 terrifying minutes. The university, designed for construction of the future, had been forced into the role of a tomb, its halls forever stained by the memory of the light that had been extinguished within them. The investigation that followed the massacre at the École Polytechnique was not merely a search for a perpetrator, for the gunman had ended his own life, leaving no one to arrest and no trial to conduct. Instead, it became an exhaustive, agonizing autopsy of a life, the life of Mark Lepine. The police and intelligence services were tasked with the impossible burden of understanding how a man could walk among them, functioning in society, while harboring a darkness so absolute it threatened to tear the social fabric of the entire nation. The investigation spiraled outward, moving from the sterile, blood-stained classrooms of the university to the cramped, desolate room where Lepine had spent his final days, an apartment that became a primary artifact in the search for the why. Detectives scoured his belongings, looking for threads that had connected his internal world to the external carnage. They found documents, letters, and personal notes that painted a portrait of a man drowning in a sea of his own making. These were not the ramblings of a random madman, but the calculated, deliberate grievances of someone who felt entitled to a status he believed the world had denied him. The investigative team, led by seasoned homicide detectives, found themselves navigating a labyrinth of resentment. They discovered his history of rejections, his unsuccessful attempts to gain entry into university, and his deep-seated conviction that women were the primary obstacle to his success. It was a terrifying revelation. The killer had not been a product of a sudden snap or a momentary lapse in sanity, but a man who had methodically built a philosophy around his own failure. The suspects in the investigation were no longer people, but the societal structures and environmental influences that Lepine had cited in his writings. The investigation branched into his past, interviewing family members, former employers, and acquaintances who had known him as a quiet, detached, and often unnerving presence. Each interview brought more questions than answers. They spoke of a man who was chronically unable to form genuine human connections, someone who viewed social interactions as transactions where he was constantly being cheated. He was a person who lived in the margins, watching the world with a cold, analytical eye, yet unable to participate in the collaborative, empathetic spirit that bound others together. The detectives were struck by the sheer banality of his day-to-day life. He bought groceries. He paid his rent. He navigated the city like everyone else. Yet he was constructing a violent fantasy in the privacy of his own mind. One of the most significant and distressing avenues of the investigation was the verification of the hit list found in his final note. The police worked with a sense of urgent, panicked duty, notifying each of the 19 women mentioned in his letter. They were powerful, high-profile figures in Quebec, journalists, politicians, and activists, all of whom were being targeted simply for their success and their voices. The investigation became an immediate security operation, as officers were deployed to protect these women from a killer who was already dead, yet whose shadow still loomed over their lives. It was a chilling reminder that Lepine's influence extended beyond the grave. He had intended to decapitate the leadership of the very movement he despised. The investigators stood guard outside the homes of these women, the weight of potential carnage they had prevented settling heavily upon them. As the investigation deepened, the focus shifted toward the systemic gaps that had allowed a man with such clear, escalating dangerous tendencies to remain unchecked. There were intense, often brutal questions directed at the administrative and psychological monitoring systems. How had someone with his history of instability been able to legally acquire a high-powered, semi-automatic weapon? The investigation into his purchase of the Ruger Mini 14 revealed a disturbing lack of friction in the process. He had navigated the regulations with the same clinical efficiency he had used in his rampage, exploiting the gaps in a system that was fundamentally unprepared for the kind of ideological terror he was about to unleash. The detectives combed through records, tracing the gun's origins, but each step only confirmed the terrifying reality that the tools of his destruction were easily accessible, hidden behind a veneer of legality. The investigation hit a series of agonizing blind alleys when it came to preventing future tragedies of similar nature. The team attempted to profile his psychological deterioration, looking for the specific trigger points that transformed his passive bitterness into active violence. They found none. There was no single, definitive event, no traumatic breakup, no catastrophic job loss, no clear external catalyst that explained the shift. It was a slow, cumulative process of radicalization, a self-reinforcing loop of misogynistic literature and internal monologue. This lack of a clear, external trigger left the investigators with a haunting, unresolved question. How does a society identify a threat that is not announcing itself through overt, external action? The media, both domestic and international, began to apply their own pressures, creating a secondary, chaotic investigation in the public eye. Reporters and commentators scrambled to categorize Lepine, with some attempting to portray him as a lone, disturbed individual, while others rightly pointed toward the systemic issue of domestic violence and the pervasive, often ignored culture of misogyny. The police were caught in the middle, trying to maintain the integrity of their forensic investigation, while the public discourse became increasingly polarized. They had to balance the need for transparency with the need to protect the dignity of the victims' families, who were being bombarded by intrusive inquiries and sensationalist narratives. By the time the investigation into the particulars of the crime had reached its technical conclusion, it left the authorities with profound, lingering sense of unease. They had successfully reconstructed the how of the crime, the logistics of the killing, and the background of the killer, but they had failed to answer the fundamental why that would satisfy a grieving nation. The investigators left the file on École Polytechnique not with a sense of closure, but with a warning. They had mapped the anatomy of a monster, only to find that the monster was a man who had mirrored the prejudices and the simmering, often polite, hatreds of society around him. The investigation concluded that Lepine was not an anomaly but a dark, distorted reflection of systemic failures. The detectives, having stared into the void for months, emerged with a sobering realization that they had not just solved a case, they had documented a deep, festering wound in the heart of their culture, one that would require far more than police work to begin to heal. The files were closed, the boxes were put into storage, but the chilling evidence of his ideology remained a permanent, disturbing document of how quickly the pursuit of order could be shattered by the unchecked, violent impulses of a single, hate-filled individual. The breakthrough that finally pierced the fog of the investigation was not a single lightning bolt realization, but the agonizing accumulation of data that forced a shift in the very definition of the crime. For weeks, the investigative team had been circling the periphery, treating the massacre as an isolated act of a mentally unstable individual, a lone wolf scenario that, while horrific, provided a comforting boundary of containment. They searched for a neurological anomaly, a singular traumatic event, or a breakdown in medical oversight. But as the files grew and the psychological reconstruction of Mark Lepine's life took shape, the team was forced to confront an uncomfortable, tectonic shift in their understanding. This was not a malfunction of one man's mind, but a deliberate, ideological operation. The pivot point arrived when the forensic analysts and criminal psychologists stopped looking for madness and started looking for motivation. The turning point was a systematic cataloging of the recovered documents, which were not chaotic ramblings but manifesto of sorts articulated with chilling, cold-blooded clarity. The investigators realized that Lapine had spent months, perhaps years, researching, planning, and refining his objective. This was not a moment of weakness. It was a moment of terrifying, focused strength. He had surveyed the campus, identified the demographic of his targets with ruthless efficiency, and prepared his weapon with a clear, specific intention. He was not a man losing control. He was a man exercising total, destructive control over a landscape he despised. The breakthrough forced a confrontation between the police and the societal narrative. For the first time, investigators began to speak openly about the role of misogyny in the crime. They had previously been hesitant to label the act as political, fearing it would politicize the tragedy and further traumatize the victims' families. However, the evidence from the classroom, the testimony of the survivors who heard his declaration, and the specificity of his hit list made it impossible to categorize the act as anything other than a targeted strike against women's advancement. The realization that he had separated the men from the women before opening fire became the centerpiece of the new investigative framework. It shattered the madman theory. A madman is driven by the irrational, but Lapine was driven by a hyper-rational, albeit hateful, agenda. This conceptual breakthrough had profound, immediate consequences. It transformed the way the investigation was framed to the public and to the legal system. It was no longer about why one man had snapped. It was about how one man had felt authorized to execute a violent vendetta against an entire movement. The police shifted their efforts toward analyzing the broader subcultures of anti-feminist sentiment and the echo chambers where Lapine had found his intellectual justification. They began looking at the pamphlets, the underground newsletters, and the early digital precursors of online hate groups that existed even in 1989. They discovered that Lapine was not operating in a vacuum. He was a symptom of a deep, pervasive resentment that was festering in the dark corners of their society. The realization brought a heavy, solemn atmosphere to the investigative team. The detectives, many of whom had been working 18-hour days for months, felt a sense of profound exhaustion, not just from the labor, but from the weight of the insight they had achieved. They had reached the heart of the darkness and found that it was not a monster, but a man who had felt completely empowered by his hate. They had mapped the path of his radicalization and understood that it was a path that was still open to others. The breakthrough was not a triumphant success. It was a devastating clarification of the threat. It meant that the police were no longer just tracking a murderer. They were tasked with understanding a systemic rot. The breakthrough also changed the relationship between the authorities and the families of the victims. In the initial days, the families wanted to know why he chose their loved ones. The breakthrough provided a bitter, impossible answer. He chose them because of their promise, their ambition, and their status as women in a field he believed was his birthright. There was no personal grudge, no specific animosity, just the cold, calculated targeting of a demographic. This realization, while gut-wrenching, allowed the families to stop looking for a fault in their own children. They were not victims of a random act of fate. They were casualties of an ideological war. This clarity, while painful, provided a necessary foundation for the public discourse that was to follow. As the investigation reached its final phases, the breakthrough served as a bridge between the forensic reality of the case and the legislative future of the country. The detectives knew that their findings would be the bedrock for a national conversation on gun control and gender-based violence. They understood that the evidence they had compiled, the precise, chillingly premeditated nature of the attack, would be the argument that could not be ignored. They had documented the what and the how so thoroughly that the why became undeniable. The breakthrough had one final, haunting effect on the investigators themselves. It stripped away the illusions of safety that many had maintained throughout their careers. They had spent their lives believing that the law was a barrier against chaos, a sturdy wall that kept the darkness at bay. But this case had proven that the wall could be bypassed by someone who held a mirror up to society they were sworn to protect. The investigators realized that the breakthrough was not just about understanding the tragedy of 1989. It was about recognizing fragility of the peace they were maintaining. They emerged from the case with a sober, hardened perspective, knowing that their work was not just about solving crime, but about witnessing a threshold that the nation had crossed. The case of Mark Lapine was no longer just a file on a shelf. It was a foundational text in the understanding of modern terror, a testament to the fact that when hatred is allowed to fester, the consequences are not merely personal. They are collective, devastating, and entirely tragically predictable. The absence of a traditional trial, where a perpetrator stands in the dock to face the weight of public and legal scrutiny, created a haunting, hollow resonance in the wake of the École Polytechnique massacre. Because Mark Lepine had ended his own life, the justice system was deprived of its ultimate function, the confrontation. There would be no closing arguments from a prosecutor, no trembling testimony from a killer under cross-examination, and no reading of a verdict that offered the thin, fragile closure of the state's official judgment. Instead, the justice associated with this case became an amorphous, long-term process of institutional and societal reckoning that moved far beyond the walls of a courtroom. However, in the days and months following the shooting, the halls of the justice system, the coroner's inquests and the legislative assemblies, became the surrogate arenas where the battle for accountability was fought. The coroner's inquest became the primary instrument for delivering justice, serving as a formal public examination of the facts that was intended to soothe the raw, exposed nerves of a nation. It was a rigorous, often agonizing procedure. The inquest rooms were filled with the families of the victims, their present a somber, silent challenge to the authorities. They demanded to know not just the details of the shooting, but the systemic failures that allowed it to occur. The testimony provided during these sessions was harrowing. Survivors recounted the chilling, clinical order with which Lepine had moved through the rooms, the coldness of his voice, and the utter lack of humanity in his eyes. For many, this was the first time they were forced to confront the granular details of the final minutes, and the inquest served as a crucible for their collective grief. One of the central themes of these proceedings was a critique of the police response. The delay in the tactical team's entry into the school became a flashpoint for intense, often bitter debate. Lawyers representing the families of the victims grilled the police commanders on the protocol of the time, which favored caution and containment over immediate, aggressive engagement. The tension in the room was palpable as the detectives were forced to justify their actions or lack thereof in the face of a tragedy that had clearly outpaced their training and their imagination. The inquest became an arena where the institution of the police had to reconcile its own limitations with the absolute, devastating reality of the massacre. It was a form of justice that was not punitive, but administrative, focused on the painful necessity of learning from the catastrophic failure of the state to protect the most vulnerable. Outside the coroner's office, the justice of the case manifested in the sweeping, seismic shifts in Canada's legislative landscape. The realization that Lepine had accessed his weapon with such ease turned the heat of public anger toward the government's policies on firearm ownership. The legislative chambers in Ottawa became the site of a long, bruising fight. The proponents of stricter gun control, driven by the memory of the 14 women, argued that the right to bear arms must be balanced against the collective right to live in safety. This was not a quick or easy victory. It was a grueling legislative marathon that spanned years, pitting traditional hunting and sporting communities against a populace that was demanding a fundamental reordering of priorities. The justice sought here was preventive, a hope that by changing the law, the horrific reality of that December night could be prevented from ever repeating itself. The legacy of the justice served in the aftermath was also found in the cultural transformation regarding the classification of such acts. Before 1989, crimes of this nature were frequently reduced to the actions of a lone madman, a designation that absolved society of responsibility. The legal and social discourse surrounding the Polytechnique massacre forced a change in vocabulary. Experts, activists, and legal scholars began to categorize the event not just as homicide, but as femicide, a targeted, systemic violence against women based on their gender. This shift in terminology was a form of justice in itself. It recognized the victims not as collateral damage in a random explosion of violence, but as individuals whose lives were taken specifically because of who they were and what they represented. The families of the victims, in their own way, conducted a form of justice that was quiet, persistent, and deeply personal. They refused to let the names of their daughters be forgotten. They established scholarships, created memorials, and campaigned for educational reforms, ensuring that the void left by their loss was filled with a legacy of advancement. They channeled their grief into a force for structural change, turning their private mourning into a public, nationwide movement. Their refusal to disappear, their insistence on being present at every hearing, every memorial, and every policy discussion served as a living indictment of the violence they had endured. They became the moral conscience of the nation, providing a form of justice that transcended the sterile confines of the law. As the years passed, the justice of the case became synonymous with the annual National Day of Remembrance. Every December 6th, the country would pause, the flags would fly at half-mast, and the names of 14 women would be read aloud, one by one. This ritual was a rejection of the perpetrator's goal. Lapine had wanted to silence them, to eradicate their presence from the engineering field, and to strike a blow against the very idea of progress. The collective, annual act of remembering was the ultimate defeat of his ideology. By centering the victims and their potential rather than the killer and his resentment, the nation performed a final, enduring act of justice. It was a commitment to keep their stories alive, ensuring that their names were synonymous not with the finality of their deaths, but with the persistence of their ambitions. Ultimately, the lack of a traditional trial left a vacuum that was filled by something more complex and perhaps more permanent, a societal mandate. The justice delivered was not a sentence passed down by a judge, but a vow taken by society. It was a promise to acknowledge the reality of gender-based violence, to question the accessibility of weapons, and to continue the hard, unfinished work of creating an environment where every individual, regardless of their gender, can pursue their potential without the threat of ideological terror. The trial of Mark Lapine never occurred in a courtroom, but he has been tried in the court history, his legacy reduced to a cautionary, dark shadow against which the ongoing, vital progress of the nation is measured. In this way, the justice was not a moment in time, but continuous, living practice of vigilance and remembrance. The aftermath of December 6, 1989, did not conclude with the finality of a court judgment or the passing of a legislative bill. It settled into the marrow of Canadian identity, a permanent, chilling reminder of the fragility of peace. To reflect on the École Polytechnique massacre is to confront the terrifying realization that the infrastructure of our society, our universities, our laws, our collaborative spaces, is only as resilient as the people who inhabit them. The tragedy forced Canada into a period of profound, often painful introspection, moving from the immediate shock of the event to a long-term, structural attempt to address the rot of misogyny that had been exposed in such a brutal, daylight fashion. The massacre remains a scar, but it is also a site of continuous, evolving memory, serving as a lighthouse that warns of the dangers of unchecked resentment and the lethal consequences of ideological isolation. For the survivors, the aftermath was a journey through a landscape forever altered. They carried the weight of the day in the small, seemingly mundane details of their lives. The sudden anxiety triggered by the sound of a closing door, the lingering instinct to skin a room for exits, the profound, quiet solidarity found in the circles of those who had shared the same nightmare. Their resilience was not a sudden hardening. It was a slow, deliberate act of reclaiming their right to exist in the spaces that had been marked by death. Many of them dedicated their lives to the engineering field, not in spite of what happened, but as a deliberate defiance of the killer's intent. By succeeding, by building, and by leading, they ensured that the field he sought to purify of women became more diverse, more inclusive, and more vibrant than it ever could have been had he succeeded in his horrific design. The legacy of the massacre is also deeply etched into the fabric of the university itself. École Polytechnique did not retreat into the shadows. It became a symbol of institutional transformation. The campus has become a place where the memory of the 14 women is integrated into the educational mission. They are not merely names on a plaque. They are the inspiration for new initiatives, mentorship programs for women in STEM, and a renewed commitment to fostering an academic environment that is grounded in empathy as much as in logic. The institution, once a site of unimaginable violence, has become a testament to the fact that when faced with darkness, a community can choose to become a source of sustained, proactive light. On a national level, the massacre catalyzed a shift in how Canada addresses the intersection of gender and violence. It moved the conversation away from the private, hidden shame of domestic abuse and toward a public, policy-driven understanding of femicide. The annual National Day of Remembrance is more than a ritual of grief. It is a vital, yearly audit of the nation's progress. It serves as a moment to ask, how are we treating women in our professional spaces? Are we effectively dismantling the barriers of systemic inequality? Are we recognizing the early warning signs of radicalization in our young men? These questions, once ignored or pushed to the periphery, are now central to the country's political and social discourse. The tragedy forced a nation to look in the mirror and acknowledge that the monster of 1989 was not an alien intruder, but a product of the very environment that now works so diligently to prevent his recurrence. Yet, there is a sober, necessary humility in this reflection. To claim that the problem has been solved would be a betrayal to victims. The digital age has introduced new, more complex challenges, as the seeds of the ideology Lapine espoused, the hatred of women, the sense of aggrieved entitlement, the isolation, find fertile ground in the dark, echo-chambered corners of the internet. The lone wolf dynamic has evolved into a global network of radicalization, making the work of prevention even more arduous. The message of the aftermath, therefore, is not one of victory, but one of vigilance. It is a recognition that the fight against ideological terror is not a race to a finish line, but a constant, necessary maintenance of the social contract. The message for future generations is clear. The brilliance of the women lost at École Polytechnique was not merely in their academic potential, but in their collective presence. They were the pioneers who had dared to walk through the heavy doors of the engineering school and claim a future that had not been built for them. To honor them is to continue their work, to insist on the absolute necessity of equality, and to nurture a culture that prizes collaboration over competition and inclusion over exclusion. The massacre was an attempt to silence the future, but it failed. The stories of Genevieve, Helene, Natalie, Barbara, and their sisters have inspired thousands more to enter the field, to pick up the drafting pens, to solve the complex equations, and to build the bridges that they were meant to design. As the years continue to pass, the event may move further into the annals of history, but its weight does not diminish. It serves as a cornerstone of the modern Canadian consciousness, a reminder that the cost of intolerance is the loss of our best and brightest. The final reflection on this tragedy must be one profound, quiet gratitude for the progress that has been made, paired with a relentless, unshakable resolve to do more. We are the stewards of a future they were never allowed to see, and it is our obligation to ensure that it is a future defined by their legacy of ambition, their strength in the face of adversity, and their enduring, irrepressible humanity. The halls of École Polytechnique may be silent, but the echoes of what was lost and the energy of what has been built in their honor continue to resonate, a permanent, moving testament to the fact that while hatred can destroy lives, it cannot extinguish the light of those who pursue their dreams with courage, grace, and an unwavering belief in a more equitable world. The epilogue of the Polytechnique tragedy is not written in stone, nor is it contained within the archives of police or the legislative records of the Canadian government. Instead, it is written in the lives of the millions of people who have come to understand this massacre as a defining moment in the modern struggle for equality. As we step back from the granular details of the investigation, the forensic evidence, and the legal shifts, we are left with broader, more profound truth. The story of December 6, 1989, is a continuous, living dialogue between the past and the future. The 10th part of this narrative is not a conclusion, but an invitation. An invitation to every reader, every student, and every citizen to carry the weight of this memory with a sense of purposeful responsibility. The true epilogue lies in the transformation of the engineering profession itself. For years, the discipline was viewed through a cold, purely technical lens, often characterized by its rigid adherence to laws of physics and material constraints. Yet, in the years following the massacre, the culture within these faculties began to change. There was a deliberate movement toward fostering environments that were not just intellectually rigorous, but also emotionally and socially intelligent. The profession began to recognize that engineering is not just about building structures. It is about building the world. And that world requires the participation, the perspective, and the leadership of all genders. The tragedy served as a brutal wake-up call for the ivory tower of academia, forcing it to confront the reality that its halls were not immune to the prejudices of the outside world. Today, the inclusive environment seen in universities across Canada is, in part, a hard-won victory bought with the sacrifice of those 14 women. Furthermore, we must address the nature of the enemy. In our attempt to understand the killer, we often focus on the pathology of the individual, but the deeper, more uncomfortable lesson of this tragedy is the pathology of the environment that produces such individuals. We live in an era where the same sentiments that fuel Lapine's rage, the sense of victimhood, the entitlement to the labor and attention of women, and the reactionary defense of traditional hierarchies, are becoming increasingly amplified by digital platforms. The epilogue of our story, then, is a warning about the persistence of these toxic ideologies. The tragedy of 1989 was a local event, but the underlying tensions are global. To read the history of the École Polytechnique is to read a cautionary tale about what happens when societies fail to engage with the alienation of their young, when they allow grievances to fester in silence, and when they permit the dehumanization of others to go unchallenged. The memory of the victims also serves as a beacon for the ongoing fight for systemic reform. It is easy to view history as a series of finished events, but the Polytechnique massacre remains active history. Every time a community gathers to mourn, every time a new scholarship is established in the name of one of the fallen, and every time a policy is reviewed to ensure it protects against gender-based violence, the tragedy is being transmuted into a catalyst for growth. The lives of the 14 women, Genevieve, Helene, Barbara, Natalie, and all their peers, are not just points on a timeline. They're the standard by which we measure our own commitment to equity. The epilogue of their story is that their potential was not extinguished, but rather redistributed. It lives on in the thousands of women who have walked through those doors since 1989, who have taken up their pens, their calculators, and their ambitions, and who have refused to be deterred by the shadows of the past. There is also a necessary reflection on the nature of collective trauma. When a nation suffers such a visceral wound, the healing process is never linear. It involves periods of progress followed by a moment of frustration when we see that the same old hatreds have found new ways to surface. The epilogue acknowledges that grief is a form of fuel. It is a raw energy that sustains the social movements, the advocacy groups, and the quiet, persistent work of individuals who refuse to let the status quo remain. We have learned that the cost of inaction is too high, and the memory of the massacre acts as a persistent low-frequency hum in the background of our political life, reminding us that there is no neutral position in the face of injustice. Silence, we have learned, is not a strategy. It is an accomplice. As we look toward the future, the epilogue reminds us of the fragility of our shared humanity. We are interconnected in ways we often choose to ignore until a moment of crisis. The tragedy at the university was a crisis of human connection, a rupture in the bonds that hold a community together. The remedy, therefore, must also be relational. It is found in the mentorship we provide to one another, the way we speak up when we witness casual misogyny, and the courage we show in standing for values that are larger than our own personal comfort. We are all stewards of the world we inhabit, and we have a collective duty to build a structure that is not only sound in its engineering, but just in its design. Ultimately, the epilogue of this story is a testament to the endurance of hope. If a man like Lapine could believe that he had the power to stop time and silence the progress of an entire demographic, he was fundamentally wrong. His actions, meant to destroy, instead galvanized. His attempts to silence, instead created a chorus of voices that continues to grow louder with each passing year. The tragedy was an attempt to impose a dark, static finality, but the response of the world was to insist on a dynamic, growing, and ever-advancing future. The women of École Polytechnique continue to live, not in the classrooms they were barred from finishing, but in the myriad ways their memory has shaped the conscience of a nation. We close this account not with a period, but with an ellipsis. The work that was interrupted on December 6, 1989, remains in progress. It is a project that is inherited by each new generation, a collaborative effort to ensure that the halls of our institutions and the streets of our cities are places where dreams are allowed to reach their fruition. We honor the victims best by recognizing that the most important construction project we face is not a bridge, a building, or a machine, but the ongoing, deliberate creation of a society that truly values every individual. This is the enduring legacy of the École Polytechnique, that even in the face of the most profound darkness, the human spirit, when joined in solidarity and purpose, possesses an inexhaustible capacity to rebuild, to learn, and to move forward into the light. The 11th part of this chronicle serves as a necessary postscript to the moral and social architecture we have been constructing throughout this narrative. If the previous sections function as a forensic and historical reconstruction of the École Polytechnique massacre, this final reflection must act as a bridge, a transition from the study of tragedy to the active, ongoing practice of societal vigilance. We must acknowledge that the story does not end with the cooling of the building's concrete or the fading of the headlines. It continues in the quiet, everyday moments where the principles of equality and human dignity are either upheld or undermined. To truly understand a massacre is to realize that it was not a singular event that occurred in isolation, but a seismic shift that recalibrated the moral compass of an entire generation. In this ongoing era, the challenges we face have undergone a metamorphosis. We no longer just contend with the physical dangers that were so devastatingly apparent in 1989. We are now navigating a complex, intangible landscape of ideological echo chambers. The epilogue of our social responsibility is now written in the digital space, where the same sentiments of aggrieved entitlement and exclusionary hatred that once occupied the dark, isolated room of one man can now be broadcast, amplified, and validated by thousands of invisible strangers. This is the new front line of the battle for the values we hold dear. The lesson from 1989 is that hatred is not a static force. It is a fluid, adaptive pathogen that seeks out the cracks in our societal foundations. Our collective vigilance must, therefore, be equally adaptive, prioritizing the health of our public discourse as much as the strength of our physical infrastructure. We must also reflect on the role of empathy in our professional and academic systems. For years, the emphasis in high-pressure disciplines like engineering was almost exclusively on technical mastery and objective performance. However, the tragedy of the École Polytechnique has fundamentally expanded that definition. We now recognize that technical excellence without a foundation of humanistic empathy is a structure without a cornerstone. The inclusion of diverse voices is not merely a social obligation or a tick-box exercise in diversity. It is an intellectual necessity. A society that excludes half of its creative and analytical potential is a society that is fundamentally failing to solve the problems of its future. The women who were lost were not just students. They were the essential components of a smarter, more robust, and more compassionate collective intelligence. By honoring them, we are actually honoring the very future of human problem solving. This ongoing commitment also requires us to look inward. It is comfortable to relegate the tragedy to the realm of monsters and madmen, as this allows the rest of us to feel secure in our own normality. But the uncomfortable truth that this narrative has attempted to illuminate is that the seeds of such hatred, the casual dismissal of others, the structural biases that prioritize one group over another, and the silent acceptance of inequality, are often found within the polite, everyday structures of our own lives. The 11th hour of this journey is an invitation to perform a personal audit of our own biases. It asks us to consider how our silence, our complicity, or our refusal to challenge subtle forms of prejudice might contribute to the atmosphere in which such tragedies are allowed to germinate. The true legacy of the victims is not just the legislation that was passed in their name, but the internal transformation of the individuals who remember them. We must also consider the legacy of the witnesses. For those who were there, and for those who have come to know the story through the archives, there is a heavy burden of stewardship. Memories are not static. They change, they fade, and they are susceptible to revisionism. The responsibility of the current and future generations is to ensure that the narrative of the Polytechnique remains an accurate, raw, and unflinching account of the human cost of intolerance. We must resist the urge to sanitize the history, to make it more palatable. We must hold the story in its full, agonizing complexity, refusing to turn it into a mere footnote or a dry statistic. This requires a form of intellectual courage, the courage to keep looking at the fire even when it is painful, so that we may learn how to better manage the heat. Furthermore, we must address the nature of our institutions. The universities, the professional bodies, and the government agencies are not autonomous machines. They are human-centered organizations that require constant, critical maintenance. The tragedy was a failure of institutional imagination, the failure to imagine that such an act could happen, and the failure to create systems of protection that were commensurate with the threat. Today, the institutional legacy is one of proactive, rather than reactive, safety. We see this in the design of modern campus safety protocols, in the rigor of mental health support systems, and in the institutionalized policies that support women in male-dominated spaces. These are not luxuries. They are the necessary safeguards for an inclusive society. The epilogue of our story is the understanding that security and freedom are not mutually exclusive. They are, in fact, mutually reinforcing. There is also a profound need to celebrate the resilience of the human spirit in the wake of such darkness. We have focused on destruction, but we must also acknowledge the creation that followed. Thousands of brilliant careers, millions of hours of innovative work, and profound, indelible mark on the landscape of Canadian engineering have all been shaped by the shadow of 1989. This is a survivor's paradox, that the memory of the light is most potent when contrasted with the intensity of the darkness that sought to obscure it. We look at the achievements of the women in science, technology, and leadership today, and we see, in every success, a flicker of the potential that was lost. We are not just mourning the past. We are living the future they were supposed to inhabit. Finally, we must recognize that this narrative, while completed here, is not finished. It is a living document that will be revisited by others in other times and in other contexts. The lessons of the École Polytechnique are universal, crossing borders and transcending cultures. They speak to the foundational necessity of respect, the inherent value of every human life, and the non-negotiable importance of equality. As we conclude this account, we leave it to the reader to become the next steward of this memory. May the legacy of these 14 lives serve not as a weight that anchors us in the past, but as a compass that directs us toward a future where the promise of the individual is never again sacrificed at the altar of ideological terror. The silence has been replaced by a chorus of voices, and in that transition lies the most enduring, most hopeful, and most important victory of all. The work continues, and with it, the memory of those who were lost, not as ghosts of a tragic yesterday, but as the enduring, radiant architects of our better tomorrow. The 12th part of our exploration into the legacy of the École Polytechnique serves as a final, quiet meditation on the nature of light in the wake of total darkness. Having journeyed through the anatomy of the tragedy, the failures of the system, and the resilience of the community, we now arrive at the most difficult task of all, finding the language to describe the persistent, quiet endurance of the human heart. To look back at the date of December 6th, 1989, is to see a fracture in time. Yet as we stand in the light of the present day, we must acknowledge that this fracture has become a source of profound, collective illumination. This final reflection is not about the shooter, nor the cold mechanics of his weapon, but about the enduring, irrepressible vitality of the women he sought to erase. When we consider the lives of Genevieve, Helene, Natalie, Barbara, and their sisters in spirit, we realize that they were not merely victims. They were, and remain, the vanguard. They were among the first of their generation to demand entry into a world that had historically been closed to them, and in doing so, they performed an act of immense, quiet bravery long before they ever stepped into the halls of the university on that final Wednesday. The epilogue of their lives is not a tragedy, but a transformation. The engineering field, once monolithic and static, has evolved into a space that is far more reflective of the world it serves. The doors that were intended to be shut forever have been flung wide open, and the voices that were meant to be silenced are now leading the charge in laboratories, boardrooms, and classrooms across the globe. This is the ultimate defiance, a life lived, a career built, and a future claimed in their honor. As we conclude this long, somber, and deeply necessary reflection, we must ask ourselves what it means to truly remember. Remembering is not a passive act of looking backward. It is an active, ongoing commitment to the principles that were violated on that day. It means recognizing that every time we speak up against the casual, subtle forms of misogyny that persist in our workplaces, we are engaging the work that was interrupted in 1989. It means understanding that the fight for equality is not a singular campaign, but a constant, daily practice of intentionality. To remember is to be a guardian of the space they were supposed to occupy, ensuring that no individual's potential is ever again curtailed by the prejudices of those who feel threatened by the progress of others. The tragedy also left behind a complex, multifaceted inheritance of grief that has, over time, matured into a profound, shared compassion. Canada, as a nation, was forced to confront its own shadows in a way it never had before. The national conversation regarding gun control, the societal approach to domestic violence, and the institutionalization of gender-based analysis in policymaking are all direct, living branches of a tree that grew from the roots of this sorrow. We see this in the way we now educate our children, in the way we mentor our young professionals, and the way we hold our institutions accountable. The darkness of the event provided a stark, inescapable contrast that made the path toward a more equitable future not only desirable but mandatory. In our final analysis, we must return to the concept of the architects of the future. The women who were lost were, in the most literal and figurative sense, architects. They were designing the foundation for a world that would be more efficient, more durable, and more balanced. Although their physical presence was taken, their blueprint remains. It is a blueprint that emphasizes the importance of community over isolation, empathy over ego, and progress over stagnation. Every engineer who graduates today with a commitment to ethical, human-centered design is, in a sense, a continuation of the work that was halted on that December night. They are the ones carrying the torch, navigating the complex calculations of a modern world with the integrity and the brilliance that the 14 women embodied. There is a profound, quiet beauty in the way that time softens the sharp edges of horror, allowing the memory to become something we can carry without being crushed by it. We move from a place of raw, immediate agony to a place of reflective, enduring purpose. The names of the women, Genevieve Bergeron, Helene Colgan, Natalie Croto, Barbara Daigneault, Amory Edward, Maud Haviernick, Barbara Kluxner-Quittejewix, Maurice Lagunier, Maurice Leclerc, Amory LeMay, Sonia Pelletier, Michelle Richard, Annie S. Arnault, and Annie Turcotte are now etched into the national consciousness not as victims, but as pillars. They are the pillars upon which a stronger, more equitable nation has been built, and their names serve as a daily reminder of the stakes involved in our ongoing pursuit of a better world. As we close this account, we leave the reader with the image of a university as it stands today. It is no longer just a place of education. It is a monument to the resilience of the human spirit. The light that shines through the windows on a cold December evening is no longer the light of a normal, mundane Wednesday. It is the light of a community that has looked into the abyss and chosen to build, to teach, and to love in spite of it. The silence that once haunted those halls has been replaced by the sound of students collaborating, debating, and dreaming of futures that were once deemed impossible. This is the victory. This is the truth that survives when the smoke has cleared and the records have been filed. We end this journey not with sense of finality, but with a sense of continuity. The story of the École Polytechnique is a testament to the fact that while hatred may have a beginning and a conclusion, the work of building a just society is endless. We are the beneficiaries of the change that followed, and we are the guardians of the memory that sustains it. May we continue to build, may we continue to question, and may we continue to live with the courage and conviction of those who were lost. Their story is now our story, and the future we construct, day by day, is the only monument that truly matters. The work remains, the light persists, and the architects of the future are all of us, standing together, building a world that is worthy of the brilliance they left behind. The 13th part of this chronicle is a reflection on the silent spaces, the places where the absence of 14 women is felt most acutely, and how that absence has paradoxically become a presence that shapes the architecture of modern conscience. We have traced a path from the chilling violence of that December night through the forensic, legal, and societal aftermath, but there remains a final, metaphysical dimension to the story. The way in which the memory of a tragedy becomes a living, breathing component of a culture's identity. This section is dedicated to the echoes, the long-term reverberations of a single act that continue to influence the ways in which we define safety, community, and the sanctity of intellectual spaces. The echo is most perceptible in the halls of the university itself, where time has not merely passed, but has been actively reclaimed. For the students who walk those corridors today, the event is history, but it is not ancient history. It is a defining legend, a foundational narrative that instructs them on the values of the institution they have joined. They enter the École Polytechnique, knowing that they are stepping into a lineage. There is a sense of stewardship that pervades a campus, a quiet, unspoken understanding that the privilege of education is inextricably linked to the history of those who were denied the opportunity to complete their own. This awareness acts as a subtle but constant regulator of the academic environment, fostering a culture of mutual respect that is perhaps more deliberate and self-aware than at other institutions. The tragedy has been integrated into the institutional soul, becoming a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is a fragile, human endeavor that must be protected with both logic and heart. Beyond the university, the echo resonates in the professional world of engineering and beyond. We see it in the changing demographics of leadership, in the conscious effort to bridge the gender gap in technical fields, and in the normalization of the idea that a truly professional environment is one that is inclusive by design. The 1989 massacre acted as a profound, if devastating, catalyst for this transition. It forced a reckoning that could no longer be ignored. The realization that the exclusion of women from scientific and technical roles was not merely a matter of social tradition, but a systemic impoverishment of the entire field. The progress we see today, the bridges built by women, the technologies designed by women, the leadership provided by women in STEM, is the living, breathing manifestation of potential that the shooter sought to terminate. In this sense, the Echo is a triumphant one. Every successful project, every breakthrough discovery made by a female engineer is a quiet defiance of the darkness. We must also reflect on the broader, international echo of the tragedy. The École Polytechnique massacre was not just a Canadian event. It became a global reference point for researchers, activists, and policymakers studying the intersection of misogyny and mass violence. It provided the data, the language, and the emotional urgency for the global movement against gender-based violence. The lessons learned in the aftermath, the necessity of coordinated responses, the importance of addressing the radicalization of men, and the critical role of public remembrance have been exported and adapted in countries across the world. The echo of Montreal has traveled across oceans, informing the way other societies confront their own demons. It has become part of a global, interlinked network of knowledge and activism, proving that even in the face of localized tragedy, there is a possibility for universal learning. Furthermore, we must address the internal, personal echoes, the ways in which the story has settled into the private lives of those who were never there, yet were deeply affected by it. There is a generation that grew up in the shadow of this event, a generation that learned of the massacre as part of their civic education. For them, the tragedy serves as a benchmark for their own values. It challenges them to consider what they stand for in the face of intolerance. It is a story that has been passed down, not as a fable, but as a hard, uncomfortable truth that defines the borders of society they wish to inherit. The echo is thus a formative force, helping to mold the moral framework of a nation's youth. It teaches them that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the active, continuous effort to maintain a culture of equality. We also find the echo in the art, literature, and cultural expressions that have emerged in the years since. The tragedy has been captured in plays, novels, films, and monuments, each attempt being a unique effort to process the unprocessable. These creative responses are vital. They allow us to keep the memory alive without it becoming a static, stagnant thing. They allow us to re-examine the tragedy from different angles, to find new meanings, and to ensure that the story remains relevant to the changing world. The cultural echo ensures that the tragedy is never forgotten, but also that it never stops evolving in our collective understanding. It is a way of keeping the 14 names resonant, ensuring that they are not just static markers of a past event, but dynamic symbols of a future we are still striving to build. As we look toward the horizon, the 14th part of our collective future will be written by our ability to keep this echo from fading. The challenge of the coming decades is to ensure that the memory of the École Polytechnique does not become a distant, muffled sound. It must remain a clear, piercing, and persistent call to action. We must continue to be the guardians of this history, ensuring that it is taught with honesty, remembered with depth, and used as a lens through which we view our ongoing progress. We must be the ones to notice when the echo is being drowned out by the noise of modern distraction, and we must be the ones to amplify it once more. The final realization of this 13th section is that the story is, in truth, an infinite loop. We reflect on the past to inform the present, which in turn sets the stage for the future. The lives that were taken in 1989 have been transformed into a timeless energy that continues to fuel the engine of our societal development. They are the architects of the bridges we now cross, the systems we rely upon, and the values we cherish. The echo is not a reminder of death. It is a reminder of an enduring, vibrant, and resilient life force that refuses to be extinguished. It is the sound of a promise kept, and a challenge issued to all who follow. We carry this echo with us, not as a burden, but as a guide, knowing that as long as we continue to build, to dream, and advocate, the light of those 14 women will never truly fade. The echo is our compass, and the future is our responsibility. The 14th part of this narrative serves as the final architectural keystone, a moment of profound synthesis where we move beyond the history of the tragedy and into the realm of our own individual agency. Throughout this extensive exploration, we have dissected the anatomy of an act of terror, the systemic failures that enabled it, the mourning of a nation, and the slow, arduous process of structural healing. Now, at the culmination of this account, the focus shifts entirely to the reader. The question that remains is no longer what happened, but rather, what will you do with this knowledge? The story they call Polytechnique is no longer a historical record. It has become a living, breathing part of the moral inheritance of every person who is engaged with its truth. To possess this knowledge is to carry a responsibility. It is a responsibility that manifests in the mundane, everyday choices that define our character. It is found in the courage to speak up when we witness the casual, often polite, degradation of others. It is found in the choice to mentor those who have been historically marginalized, to actively open doors that were once locked, and to use one's own voice to amplify those that have been silenced. The tragedy of 1989 reminds us that the social contract is not a passive document. It is a dynamic, daily performance of respect, equity, and inclusion. Every time we choose to be an ally, every time we choose to defend the dignity of another, we are performing a restorative act that counteracts the destructive intent of that dark December night. Furthermore, this final reflection must acknowledge that the fight for a truly equitable society is never finished. We often fall into the trap of believing that progress is a linear, inevitable arc, that we are simply moving toward a better, more enlightened future. But history and the memory of the 14 women teaches us that progress is a fragile, contested space that must be defended against the persistent pull of reactionary, exclusionary ideologies. We live in a world where the fear of the other, the resentment of perceived loss, and the weaponization of identity still hold a dangerous, seductive power. To believe that such tragedies could never happen again is to ignore the lesson of the past. Vigilance, therefore, is not an act of paranoia. It is an act of civic love. It is a commitment to watch over our shared spaces, our schools, our digital forums, our professional spheres, with the understanding that our stability is dependent on our collective commitment to humanity. We must also consider the transformative power of our own potential. The women lost at the École Polytechnique were not just students. They were catalysts of potential that was never allowed to fully bloom. In their absence, the collective capacity of our society was diminished. By dedicating ourselves to the pursuit of excellence, by pushing the boundaries of what is possible in our own fields, by demanding the highest standards of integrity in our own work, and by nurturing the brilliance of those around us, we act as surrogates for the potential that was stolen. We take up the drafting tools they were forced to drop. We continue the calculations they were forced to leave unfinished. Their legacy is not just a memorial. It is an active mandate to achieve the extraordinary, to build the bridges and create the solutions that define the progress of our civilization. This part of the narrative also asks us to embrace the complexity of our own identities and the identities of those around us. One of the primary drivers of the massacre was a binary, reductive, and hostile worldview that saw human worth through the lens of gender-based superiority. The antidote to such a worldview is the embrace of radical, humanistic nuance. It is a recognition that every individual is a tapestry of experiences, perspectives, and potential that cannot be categorized or dismissed. We must foster environments where this complexity is not just accepted, but actively celebrated. When we create spaces, be they classrooms or boardrooms, that are truly inclusive, we are not just correcting a systemic wrong. We are enriching the collective intelligence of our entire species. We are building a world that is fundamentally smarter, more creative, and more resilient because it reflects the full, vibrant spectrum of human possibility. We must also reflect on the role of sorrow. Grief, in its raw, unmediated form, is a destructive force, but when it is transformed into purpose, it becomes a wellspring of profound, inexhaustible power. The families of the 14 women demonstrated this transformation with a dignity that has served as a beacon for the entire country. They showed us that the most profound response to violence is the act of constructive creation. By channeling their pain into scholarships, advocacy, and educational change, they have proven that even the most immense tragedy can be repurposed into a source of enduring, life-affirming light. This is a lesson for us all. When we encounter the darker aspect of our world, we have the agency to choose how we respond. We can succumb to the paralyzing weight of cynicism, or we can choose a harder, more courageous path of active, constructive, and persistent hope. As we bring this account to a close, let the final image be one of infinite, open potential. Think of the campus of the École Polytechnique not as a site of ending, but as a site of perpetual beginning. Every day, the sun rises over Mount Royal, casting its light on the limestone facades, and every day, a new cohort of students walks through those doors, their minds filled with the ambition to build, to solve, and to shape the future. They walk in the footsteps of those who came before them, and they walk toward a future that is wider, more inclusive, and more promising because of the sacrifices that have been made in the name of progress. The history of the Polytechnique is a history of the triumph of human spirit over human cruelty. It is a story that proves that while an individual life can be taken, the force of their ambition, their talent, and their humanity cannot be contained. Ultimately, the 14th part of this journey is simply us. We are the continuation of the story. We are the stewards of the memory, the architects of the future, and the guardians of the values that were defended at the cost of 14 lives. May we carry this knowledge not as a burden, but as a guiding fire. May we be brave enough to confront the shadows, wise enough to learn from history, and persistent enough to keep building, day by day, a world that is worthy of the memory of those who were lost. The work is never truly done, but it is deeply, profoundly worthwhile. With this understanding, we take our place in the long, unfolding story of human advancement, standing on the shoulders of those who paved the way, and looking forward to the infinite possibilities of the horizon. The light remains, the work remains, and together we move forward. The final movement of our chronicle, the 15th part, transcends the specifics of the tragedy, the institutional reforms, and the personal responsibilities we have explored. It serves as a philosophical meditation on the nature of legacy, a term often used to describe the past, but which here is understood as the engine of our future. To reach this point in our narrative is to understand that the École Polytechnique massacre is not an object to be studied in a museum of historical horrors. It is an active, living current that runs through the veins of our society. The legacy of those 14 women has become a fundamental element of our collective DNA, a silent moral compass that orientates our progress toward a future where the equality of human potential is not a debate, but a foundational axiom. We must reflect on the phenomenon of the light that remains. When an individual is taken from the world, there is an immediate, devastating vacuum. But in the years following 1989, we have seen that light does not simply vanish. It refracts. It has split into thousands of individual rays, each one representing a woman who, inspired by the memory of those lost, has chosen to enter the field of engineering, to become a scientist, to pursue leadership in government, or to advocate for justice. This refraction is the true grand legacy of the tragedy. Every time a young girl walks into a physics lab and feels she belongs, a piece of that light is shining. Every time a woman is promoted to a position of authority in a technical field, the potential that was cut short in 1989 is finally being realized. We are witnessing a multi-generational harvest of brilliance that was planted in the soil of sorrow. This 15th part also invites us to consider the courage of the quiet. Much of our narrative has focused on the loud, public manifestations of change, the legislation, the speeches, the monuments, but the most significant impact of the tragedy lies in the quiet, tectonic shifts in human consciousness. It is found in the way fathers now speak to their daughters about their possibilities, in the way male colleagues in the engineering field have become active allies in the fight for true inclusivity, and in the way our educational systems have moved to dismantle the subconscious biases that once dictated who belongs in a technical space. These quiet, daily victories are the true measure of our societal evolution. They represent a fundamental, internal rejection of the ideology that Lapine tried to impose upon the world. The legacy of the massacre is, ultimately, the triumph of the quiet, persistent, everyday practice of equality. As we look further into Horizon, we must also acknowledge the test of time. The danger in any historical event is that it can, over decades, become flattened, reduced to a date on a calendar or a brief mention in a textbook. Our duty, and the legacy we are tasked with upholding, is to ensure that the École Polytechnique massacre retains its sharp, visceral power to provoke and to teach. We must fight against the normalization of the event. We must keep the story raw. We must ensure that future generations do not just know about the tragedy, but that they feel the gravity of what was lost, so that they understand why the pursuit of a just world is non-negotiable. The legacy requires us to be the curators of a memory that is not static, but dynamic, a memory that continues to challenge us to be better, to look closer, and to act with greater intention. Furthermore, we must recognize that the legacy of this event has broadened our understanding of security. We have moved from a perspective where security was defined by locks, gates, and protocols to a perspective where security is defined by the depth of our human connections. We now understand that a community is most secure when its members feel seen, valued, and empowered. The ideology of the killer was rooted in a desperate, isolated alienation. The remedy, therefore, must be rooted in expansive, radical connection. We are building a security of the spirit, where the strength of our institutions is derived from the strength of our empathy. This is the most profound lesson of the last 30-plus years, that our greatest protection against the shadows is the light of our shared, unified purpose. There is also a profound final thought on the geometry of the future. If the massacre was an attempt to draw a line in the sand and dictate who could cross it, the legacy has been to erase that line entirely. We are now in the business of building bridges where the killer sought to build walls. We are in the business of creating a geometry that is inclusive, fluid, and multidimensional. Every project completed by a diverse, empowered team is a rejection of the narrow, binary worldview that led to violence. We are proving that human achievement is not a zero-sum game, that the success of one does not diminish the success of another, but rather that our collective potential is expanded when every individual is given the opportunity to contribute their unique voice to the choir of human progress. As we conclude this 15-part narrative, let us hold the image of the university not as it was in 1989, but as it is today, a vibrant, bustling, living center of inquiry and creation. The shadows have not disappeared, but they have been surrounded by the brilliant, pervasive light of thousands of lives being lived with purpose. The legacy of the 14 women is a permanent fixture in the landscape of our humanity. They are the silent partners in every innovation, the hidden inspirations for every breakthrough, and the enduring guides in every challenge we face. They are the architect of a future they never got to see. And because of them, we are all living in a world that is fundamentally more hopeful, more just, and more profoundly alive. The work does not end here. It never ends. The legacy is a task, a request for us to be the very best versions of ourselves, to work with the highest integrity, and to care for one another with a tenacity that mirrors the resilience of those who refuse to let their spirits be broken. We take this legacy with us as we step out into the world, carrying the memory of the past as the map for the future. The light of those 14 lives continues to shine, not just as a reminder of what was lost, but as a testament to the infinite, beautiful, and irrepressible potential of what we are capable of building together. We are the architects now. The blueprints are in our hands. And the future, bright, complex, and filled with promise, awaits our first deliberate and courageous step. The story, in its truest sense, is just beginning, and it is a story that belongs to all of us. The 16th part of this chronicle is a departure from the historical narrative and into the realm of the infinite present. If the preceding sections provided a map of the tragedy, its aftermath, and its social legacy, this final contemplation addresses the necessity of silence. The quiet, internal space where the horror of 1989 is finally integrated into the soul of the individual. To truly honor the victims is to move beyond the analytical, the political, and the commemorative, and to arrive at a place of profound, personal stillness. It is in this space that we acknowledge the limits of our language, the inadequacy of our metaphors, and profound, humbling reality that some traumas are so vast they can never be fully explained, only carried, integrated, and transformed into a silent, unshakable resolve. We often try to solve our history, treating events as puzzles that, once reconstructed, yield a satisfying answer. But the Cal Polytechnique massacre resists this. It stands as a dark, jagged pillar in the landscape of our modern history, a reminder that human malice can reach into the most orderly, rational spaces and inflict damage that defies repair. To reach this 16th point of reflection is to accept the reality of irreparable. We must recognize that the parents who lost their daughters, the survivors who still carry the phantom sounds of the gunfire, and the community that was scarred, have lived with an ache that no policy, no speech, and no monument can ever fully soothe. There is a dignity in acknowledging this irreparable nature of the loss. It is a way of saying that their lives were so infinitely valuable that their departure leaves a void that nothing in this world can ever truly fill. This space of silence is also a space of reconciliation with our own limitations. We are a species that prides itself on progress, on the ability to engineer our way out of any problem, to solve for X and arrive at a solution. But the tragedy teaches us that we are also vulnerable to our own shadow. The 15th part spoke of the architects of the future, but the 16th part speaks of the stewards of the abyss. We must be able to stand on the edge of the dark, acknowledging the reality of violence, without being pulled into it. We must be able to hold the memory of the massacre not as a trauma that paralyzes us, but as a weight that anchors us. We are not just building. We are also tending the ground, ensuring that the soil remains fertile enough for hope, but also aware of the stones that lie beneath the surface. In this stillness, we find a new definition of courage. It is no longer the grand cinematic courage of the battlefront, but the quiet, daily courage of the teacher who continues to inspire, the student who continues to study, and the citizen who continues to believe in the possibility of a better society. Even when the evidence of the world seems to contradict that belief, this courage is a slow, steady burning. It is a refusal to become cynical. It is a determination to remain soft in a world that often demands we become hard. To choose kindness in a culture of hostility, to choose inclusion in a culture of division, and to choose active listening in a culture of shouting. These are most profound acts of rebellion against the ideology that Mark Lepine stood for. We must also consider the symphony of names. In the quiet, we no longer see them as victims of a historical event, but as individuals whose singular existence continues to influence the resonance of our own lives. When we breathe their names, Genevieve, Helene, Natalie, Barbara, Emery, Maud, Barbara, Maurice, Amory, Sonia, Michelle, Annie, we are not reciting a list. We are engaging in a ritual of affirmation. We are saying that their existence preceded the tragedy, and that their essence has survived it. We are affirming that their light, once ignited, belongs to the permanent tapestry of human experience. This is the ultimate silent victory, the refusal to let the narrative of their lives be defined by their final 20 minutes. Their lives are defined by the hundreds of thousands of minutes that came before, the late-night study sessions, the aspirations, the friendships, the laughter, the quiet struggles, and the grand, soaring dreams. As we linger in this silence, we are also invited to appreciate the complexity of the world they left behind. It is a world that is flawed, yes, but it is also a world that is capable of breathtaking beauty. The engineering marvels that span our rivers, the medical breakthroughs that save lives, the artistic expressions that move us to tears. These are the triumphs of the humanity that they were a part of. The tragedy did not end the story of human potential. It merely re-emphasized the importance of protecting it. We are the inheritors of that potential. We are the ones who are responsible for the next chapter. And as we stand in this quiet space, we realize that the most profound way to honor the past is to live with ferocity of purpose in the present. The silence of this final part is also a form of sanctuary. It is a place where we can rest from the labor of reconstruction and simply be. It is a place where we acknowledge that we are all, in some small way, affected by what happened on that December night. We are all members of a community that was forced to grow up to face the reality of its own contradictions, and to choose, over and over again, to stay together. The tragedy is a thread that runs through our shared identity, a reminder that we are responsible for one another. This responsibility is not a burden. It is the essential, animating force of our democracy. We are the keepers of the flame, and the flame is kept not by grand public displays, but by the quiet, steady breath of our collective commitment. We conclude this 16th reflection not with a sense of completion, but with a sense of continuity. The story is a circle, and we are at the point where the circle meets the next beginning. We take the knowledge, the sorrow, the resolve, and the hope that we have gathered through this journey, and we step back out into the light of the ordinary day. The work is waiting. The drafting tables are full. The systems need our focus, and the people around us need our empathy. We carry the memory of the École Polytechnique, not as a weight that drags us down, but as a ballast that keeps our ship steady in the turbulent seas of the modern world. We move forward with the knowledge that we have looked into the dark, we have accounted for the loss, and we have chosen, with every cell of our being, to keep building, to keep learning, and keep believing in the potential of the human spirit. The silence ends here and the action begins. The future is waiting, and it is a future we are building together. Honor-bound, a memory of those who showed us the true, irreducible value of a life lived with purpose and courage. The flame remains, the path remains, and we walk it side by side into the light. The 17th part of this chronicle is a deep dive into the philosophy of construction, the idea that in the face of absolute destruction, the most revolutionary act is to build. We have traversed the landscape of the 1989 massacre, navigated the legal and systemic aftermath, and held the silence of personal reflection. Now, we must articulate the blueprint for the future that the victims were never permitted to draft. This section explores how the legacy of the École Polytechnique is not merely a memorial, but a continuous, active process of engineering a society that can withstand the pressures of intolerance. The bridge is our primary metaphor, and structure that connects two distant points, define the chasm between them, requiring precision, balance, and an unwavering commitment to the integrity of its foundation. If the massacre was an attempt to sever the connection between the ambition of women and the reality of professional success, then our response must be the infinite reinforcement of that connection. Engineering is not just about concrete and steel. It is about the design of our common life. When we build, we are making a statement about what we value. A bridge that allows people to traverse a dangerous river is an act of empathy. A building that provides a safe, inclusive space for a community is an act of justice. Every act of creation is an implicit rejection of the nihilism that fueled Lepine's violence. We are the architects now, and we are tasked with drafting a world where the structures we build, both literal and metaphorical, are designed to support the flourishing of every individual, irrespective of the prejudices that have historically sought to gatekeep the future. The philosophy of construction also demands that we recognize the fragility of the materials we use. In our social architecture, the primary material is human trust. Trust is a load-bearing element of any democracy. When that trust is shattered, as it was on that December night, the entire structure undergoes a catastrophic strain. The labor of the last 36 years has been a meticulous process of reinforcing that trust, adding layers of transparency, inclusivity, and accountability. We have learned that if we do not intentionally maintain the social bond, the rust of apathy will eventually compromise the integrity of our institutions. This is the lesson we pass to the new generation of engineers, that your technical expertise is hollow if it is not matched by a profound, professional commitment to the ethical health of society you serve. We must also confront the load-bearing capacity of our institutional memory. Memory is not a passive artifact. It is a weight-bearing structure. If we allow it to crumble, the roof of our moral awareness begins to sag. We have seen how easily history can be distorted or forgotten, leading to a repetition of past failures. Therefore, our responsibility is to provide constant, structural support to the memory of the École Polytechnique. This means formalizing the remembrance in our curricula, in our professional odes, and in our public spaces. It means ensuring that when a student enters an engineering program, they understand the cost at which their seat was purchased. It means that the memory must be the steel reinforcement hidden beneath the surface of our professional identity, providing the strength that allows us to stand upright even when the winds of social conflict threaten to blow us over. This section also invites a reconsideration of error analysis. In engineering, an error is a failure of logic, a mistake in calculation, or a defect in material that leads to a collapse. The 1989 massacre was an error in the system, but it was also a warning about the material of our culture, a material that contained hidden fissures of resentment and misogyny. An honest engineer does not hide a structural failure. They publish it, analyze it, and change the design specifications to prevent it from ever happening again. Our society must be equally transparent about our own structural failures. We must hold ourselves to the standard of a post-disaster investigation, where no detail is too small, no institution is too sacred, and no ideology is too entrenched to be held accountable. This is how we ensure that our societal design is always evolving, always becoming more robust, and always learning from the collapses of the past. Furthermore, we must address the human factor in our designs. We often speak of engineering as if it were a dispassionate, objective science, but the reality is that the human experience is the core of every design project. We build for people. We build for the mother commuting to work, the child walking to school, the student dreaming of a career in the sciences, and the community that relies on us for their safety. The massacre taught us that when we depersonalize our work, we risk losing the very reason for its existence. We must rehumanize our institutions. We must design our systems with a deep, visceral understanding of human dignity, recognizing that every technical decision has a human impact. The legacy of the 14 women is a reminder that the human element is not a variable to be managed. It is the purpose of the entire equation. As we look toward the next horizon, we recognize that the project is infinite. There is no final completion date for the construction of a just society. It is a work in progress, a constant renovation, and an ongoing refinement. We will encounter new challenges, technological, social, environmental, and political, that will test the integrity of our structure. We will face storms we cannot currently predict and stresses we have yet to calculate. But the philosophy of construction gives us the resilience to face these challenges. It teaches us that because we are the builders, we also possess the power to reinforce, to repair, and to improve. We are not spectators in the construction of our history. We are the laborers, the designers, and the project managers. We take the blueprint of the last 36 years, and we extend it. We add to it the wisdom of those who survived, the memory of those who were lost, and the ambition of those who are currently learning their craft. We acknowledge that the structure we are building is a sanctuary, a place where every individual can work, dream, and achieve without fear. This is the ultimate, non-negotiable requirement of the structure. If it does not protect, it is not a success. If it does not include, it is not a success. If it does not honor the dignity of the human spirit, it is not a success. We carry this responsibility forward, moving with the steady, measured pace of professionals who know the importance of the work. The foundations are set, the steel is rising, and the work continues day by day in the quiet, focused, and determined labor of everyone who believes in a future that is structurally sound, morally upright, and profoundly, irrepressibly human. The bridge is under construction, and it is a bridge built for all. The 18th part of this chronicle is dedicated to the sustainability of conscience, the deliberate, energetic maintenance of our moral integrity in a world that is designed to distract, desensitize, and divide. Throughout our 17-part journey, we have dissected the architecture of the École Polytechnique massacre, analyzing the mechanics of hatred, the forensic reality of the tragedy, and the monumental effort required to build a more equitable future. Now, we arrive at the core challenge of our time. How do we ensure that the lessons learned remain vital? How do we prevent the hardening of the heart that so often accompanies the passage of decades, turning a traumatic milestone into a mere historical anecdote? The sustainability of conscience is a final, ongoing engineering project of our lives, and it requires a continuous infusion of energy, vigilance, and profound, active empathy. We must first address the erosion of awareness. Time is a corrosive force. It softens the sharp edges of horror, dims the intensity of grief, and eventually turns the most jarring events into background noise of history. For the society that experienced the 1989 massacre, the danger is that we have become comfortable in the structures we have built. We have passed the laws, we have held the annual ceremonies, and we have integrated the discourse of equality into our institutional handbooks. But a structure that is not maintained will eventually decay. We must treat our commitment to the memory of the 14 women not as a finished monument, but as a living, breathing garden that requires daily care. If we allow our awareness to grow stagnant, we risk becoming vulnerable once again to the very ideologies that fuel the violence we once swore to eradicate. The sustainability of conscience requires the habit of questioning. We must cultivate an environment where the status quo is constantly interrogated. When we walk to the halls of our universities or sit in the meeting rooms of our corporations, we must habitually ask, who is missing? Whose voice is being silenced? What implicit biases are informing our decision-making? The massacre was not just a failure of one man's mind. It was a failure of a system that did not ask enough questions about the exclusion of women. To be an engineer of the future is to be an eternal questioner. We must push back against the comfortable, the familiar, and the exclusionary, recognizing that the health of our community depends on our willingness to make those in power feel uncomfortable with the presence of injustice. We must also foster intergenerational transmission. The memory of École Polytechnique belongs to those who were not even born when the shots were fired. If we fail to bridge the gap between our lived trauma and their inherited history, we lose the thread of the narrative. This transmission is not about imparting a sense of guilt or fear. It is about imparting a sense of agency. We must show the next generation that the progress they enjoy today, the paths they walk, the careers they pursue, the equality they take for granted, was purchased at a terrible cost, and that it is an inheritance that must be actively defended. By giving them the story, we give them the tools to recognize when the foundations are under threat. We are not just teaching them history. We are teaching them the mechanics of freedom. The sustainability of conscience also depends on our ability to humanize the technical. We have discussed the need to rehumanize our institutions, but this must be a personal practice. In an age of increasing digitization, where we interact with one another through screens and algorithms, it is easier than ever to lose sight of the individual. The ideology that Lapine embraced was one of dehumanization. He turned individuals into categories and human lives into statistics. Our counter-strategy must be the radical, individual recognition of the other. We must make a conscious effort to see the person behind the demographic, the human behind the title, and the individual behind the data point. This is the ultimate defense against the coldness of extremist ideologies. When we acknowledge the inherent, irreducible value of another person, we make it impossible for the rhetoric of hatred to find purchase in our minds. We must embrace the resilience of collective. No individual can sustain the weight of such a history alone. The massacre was a communal rupture, and the healing must be a communal practice. We find our strength in the circles of those who share our commitment to justice. We find it in the collaborations that cross professional, cultural, and political lines. The École Polytechnique legacy is a collective project, a massive, distributed design effort where everyone has a role to play. We sustain our conscience by staying connected to one another, by sharing our burdens, and by drawing courage from the realization that we are not the only ones who care. The isolation that Lapine lived in was his greatest weakness. The interconnectedness we build is our greatest strength. The 18th part also demands an admission of unfinished labor. We have built much, but the landscape of our society remains uneven. There are still communities that are marginalized, voices that are suppressed, and systemic barriers that prevent the full flourishing of human potential. To have a sustainable conscience is to be perpetually unsatisfied with the good enough. It is the spirit of the perpetual improver, the person who looks at a functional system and asks how it can be made more equitable, more accessible, and more just. We are not aiming for static perfection. We are aiming for a dynamic, living, and ever-advancing fairness. This is the work that the 14 women were denied, and it is the work that we must, with all our energy and focus, continue on their behalf. As we reach the conclusion of this vast, introspective endeavor, we understand that we have been speaking not of tragedy, but of a transformation. We have been documenting the way of society, when faced with the absolute worst of human nature, chose to define its own best. The memory of the École Polytechnique is our ballast. It keeps us grounded, it keeps us focused, and it keeps us alert to the tides of the world. We take the lessons of these 18 parts, and we carry them forward into the ordinary, vital, and beautiful work of living. The legacy is not in the books we have written or the words we have spoken. It is in the way we treat the person next to us, the way we advocate for truth, and the way we build, day by day, a future that is structurally sound, morally upright, and profoundly, irrepressibly human. The work remains, the light remains, and we remain, together, the architects of our own salvation. The future is not something that happens to us. It is something we are actively, purposefully, and courageously constructing, one life, one voice, and one act of justice at a time. The light is ours to hold, and we will carry it together into the dawn.